entering the coast base now.
You really do it, Tammy. I feel like I was like okay. I like took the shower I had because I was like, too. I had like just warm, like not like normal. I just like, and every time like I was shampooing my hair and conditioner, and I would like get out from under the water because I was gonna be under the water. See. It's because my hands are so dry. I clearly put lotion on. I was like looking at mine. I was like, I can see like where I wiped off my hands.
But I mean, it's fine. It's washing.
Exactly.
That's why we're
It's not super interesting. I'll just keep explaining. I have this box. I used it in the shop. Yeah. Wall Street Times. Yeah. See what I mean though? I just don't like those windows. Yeah. Okay. It was so long. Up. It had like this. I remember it was hard to find. My friend told me. This isn't the one that I saw. don't know. I wonder if it didn't look right. Maybe. Oh yeah. No. Sketchy address. Finally, I was supposed to have it sent week after graduation. I had to do a Facebook period. They got it
So the other one I don't know how to say. It's like
Wait, what's not a second? The journalist.
how do you say it?
No, I think it's like okay, let's Google it then.
Rachel, you look tan.
Have you been somewhere warm?
No, we went to Broward.
Oh, did you go?
Yeah. Do I know look more tan?
You do look more tan, but I like, oh my god, my hair is so small.
Maybe I'm just like not
Maybe
right
it was like the light hair.
Not too.
Also,
Looks like I'm supposed to be.
but like I could see.
Okay, but we have a theory.
Oh,
yeah.
So my hands kind of got a little messed up because they were so dry that they got super tan. So
Actually, we were watching it last night.
Really?
There was a lot of points.
I guess it does look better. I exfoliated in the shower to try to. It's like my hands right here.
She's like an angel. Guardian angel.
That would make sense for like
It's supposed to be like 4 feet of running water on 5 a day of graduation. We're literally rats.
That's
It's disgusting.
Like I don't understand.
I know.
Like it's gotta be outside.
Yeah.
I have pretty and a dress that's long for that.
Oh yeah, my mom was like, "Oh, what are you wearing?" And I was like, "A poncho."
I can't wear my heels.
Poncho and my rubber boots. I don't think so. They said that we can have. They give us like a clear poncho.
Oh, so we can.
They'll give us a clear poncho. Yeah. I was like, glorified trash bag.
Yeah. That's what I'm like assuming.
Because MSAT spares no expense. And by no expense, I mean they spare all expenses. Oh my gosh. Card.
It's gonna rip with
Yeah, like, thanks, but actually, can I take this?
Yeah.
Do I have to take it?
So I watched that video last night. The guy like telling me what to do, like that out video, and it was at the end, like the last like 15.
It's your birthday today? Yeah. Happy birthday. Sorry, my notifications didn't pop up until now.
Pretty good way to. Oh, story.
For your birthday?
By having Lazarus. Federal. About how helpful state law
Like this afternoon? I haven't. I'm not staying. In my what I've heard, this is just what I've heard from like pharmacists. It's a lot.
yeah. I just don't know if it's just read books. Chill out. Yeah. Kick back.
Is it all afternoon?
I guess. It's federal law.
Oh, yeah.
9 to 12, and then state is 1 to 4.
That's better. It's just law day?
Yeah.
What?
Right? Let me make sure I got this.
I'm sure you're right. I think for some reason I felt like federal. I don't.
Yeah, so it's federal law review 9 to noon, and then state is 1 to 4. You passed it on my timeline too.
Yeah, I mean, in there.
And it was like right when I was about to
I know, and guess what? It was on there for anything else. I don't know where it's about.
I'm going to the Cheesecake Factory.
I was gonna say you deserve some kind of dessert and drinks
Yeah.
for A, being done with your last day of school.
Today on my birthday.
Was a
Yes. Yeah. Outside.
Huh? I just put my face on it. Man, see, this is why I have all the crowd. Come on. I mean, normal person would feel like are you staying for the state? For the state? Is Missouri law?
That's what the license said. I think all
Everybody's got
Oh my God, it's Johnny Bravo.
They're usually pretty good, but
And it's like, it's not teaching you. Yeah, it's like, my brother's here.
Nice. I would ever come off like
That's why we're talking loud enough so you can hear us. What? You didn't have your thing? Oh, yeah.
Didn't get a hot piece now. It's just throwing it away. Oh, listen.
I don't want to because I want to get you worked up.
I mean, it's good. Yeah.
Well then.
I didn't eat mass.
Well,
No,
Okay.
but I'm recording a lot, though.
Big break.
Yeah, well, that's what I was telling myself. Don't
you walk at graduation if you've gotten further. Is that what the moment says?
Everyone does.
Get it into
That's not enough.
What?
He looked big yesterday. Why? I hope it was my first grade. They have orientation. Oh yeah, there's the orientation. My orientation, I have a hospital orientation. Basically, they talk. I just did this. That's like 8 to 4 one day, and then one day is inside the pharmacy. And then one day they have do you want anything? What is this? On-call doesn't start until we're actually might be staying with someone.
No, I was in awe of the 714. But hello, good morning.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So it's 9 o'clock. We're going to start our board review, MPJE. So you all know the schedule, correct? This morning from 9 to 12, we do federal law. And then we break for lunch from 12 to 1. And then from 1 to 4, we will then break into the state sections. So for those of you that are staying with me in the Worcester or up in Manchester, we're going to do the mass law, and there's also going to be the New Hampshire breakout period as well during that time period. Okay? So today, what we'll also do is about every hour or so, we'll take a 5 to 10 minute break, and we'll go through the material. So for those of you that haven't already done so, hopefully you've checked online on Blackboard, and you noted the materials that are posted for you on the federal drug laws as well as the various state law components. And in the afternoon, when we talk about the mass law, I'll go through a little bit more of the way that the folders are posted and things like that and the rationale for that. Okay? But this morning, we're going to look at the multi-state pharmacy jurisprudence exam. And the first question I have for you is, you already had a review of the MPJE, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the MPJE. How many questions are on there?
120.
There's 120 questions. They're multiple choice. What do you know about the multiple choice questions? Some of them count, some of them are test questions, right? But they also, on the multiple choice questions, what they are geared towards is that some of them are like K type of questions. Most of them are case related. But then they also, since it's a computer adapted test, they require you to select all of the applicable answers. And so what that means is, let's say that a question is worded and it has 5 choices from each of the options for you to choose from. So if, hypothetically, the answer has 4 correct answers and you only select 3 out of the 4, guess what? You get that whole question wrong. Okay? So what I'm trying to tell you is that for the multi-state pharmacy jurisprudence exam, what you want to do is you want to study, you want to be prepared for the exam. And just like when we had pharmacy law, one of the first things I ever talked to you about was that no matter what anybody else ever tells you, law is the most important class. And the reason for it is because, A, it's half of the licensure requirements, at least for mass. Other states may require a wet lab or something else, right? But you all have to take an examination. You'll take the NAPLEX, you'll take the law part, right? And then other states may require the wet lab or a personal appearance in front of the board, whatever the case may be, right? But for the most part, the MPJE is geared towards the legal requirements of filling prescriptions and the responsibilities of a pharmacist. Okay? So one of the things, if you haven't already done so, is to take a look at the blueprint for the MPJE. Anybody look at the blueprint that's on your materials for the MPJE? Should be your MPJE bulletin and the NAPLEX bulletin. They do provide the breakdown for the areas in which you are responsible for. But when we look at the exam, there's a large part of the exam consists of pharmacy practice. Anywhere between 78 to 83% of the exam goes back and looks at the legal responsibilities of a pharmacist and other pharmacy personnel. So you're the pharmacist, right? You're being trained as the pharmacist. So the question comes down to is, can you fill that prescription? Can you not fill that prescription? What are the legal requirements for filling the prescription? Also, you have to look for is what's the requirements for the acquisition as well as the distribution of pharmaceutical products, including samples. Does your pharmacy board allow you to dispense samples, or is there a prohibition against samples? What about obtaining controlled substances? What's the record-keeping requirements? So you have to look at it from both the federal as well as the state side of the requirements for the acquisition and distribution of pharmaceutical drugs. Also, you're going to look at the legal requirements that may be observed in the issuance of prescriptions and drug orders. So you get a C2 prescription. Can you fill that prescription? What are the legal requirements for filling that? What about multiple issuance of C2s? What are the rules as it relates to tamper-resistant prescription blanks? You're going to need to know everything that there is possibly needing to know as a pharmacist. Now, what happens is that a lot of you work in retail, and a lot may work in practice settings other than pharmacy or retail pharmacies, like hospitals. And as a hospital pharmacist, you're probably not exposed to the day-to-day functioning of the legal requirements of the law too much as your colleagues who work in retail. But a lot of the MPJE exam is geared towards the retail pharmacist. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind. Also, what are the procedures necessary for the proper dispensing of a pharmaceutical product, including controlled substances and prescription drug orders. Right? So you see a lot of the exam focuses in on the day-to-day functioning of how are you supposed to be acting as a pharmacist. How do you counsel a patient? What are the legal requirements for counseling? So when we look at it, we're going to look at this in the afternoon, at least in the Mass part, we're going to look at it in the afternoon for the Massachusetts component. But when you make the offer to counsel, who can make the offer to counsel? Anybody? Is it really anybody? So a cashier can make the offer to counsel? No. So it's not anybody, right? It would be a pharmacist. It would be an intern. And if your state allows, it could be the technicians. Okay? Now the question that you'll have to pay attention to is, if a patient accepts counseling, who can counsel? It's the pharmacist. What about the intern? Well, if it's your state allows, under the direct supervision of your pharmacist preceptor, an intern can counsel. What does direct supervision mean? So what is direct supervision? So you're going to look at your state law for that, but mostly they are defined terms where you have your preceptor working in one area and the pharmacy technician counseling within an earshot distance, right? Well, what happens if your pharmacist is way in the back corner, way away from you counseling? Is that direct supervision? That probably won't be, right? So the other thing to take a look at is when you start to prepare and to start to review all this material is, when do you make the offer to counsel? So what are your state's requirements for counseling? When do you counsel? When do you make the offer to counsel? Every time somebody comes in. Is that the legal requirement? Or is that what you do in retail? I see people shaking their heads saying no. They don't counsel. They don't make the offer to counsel. Okay, well, we know right here that you're supposed to counsel and make the offer to counsel. But what you're going to need to do is to take a look. Some states, and this is where, it's broken up into the various pharmacy practice settings. Some states require you to make the offer of counsel only when the prescription is a new prescription to the patient. Other states, it may be a new as well as a refill. So what is it for your state? When you work in retail, what do you normally do in retail? You make the offer to counsel for all patients. Because when you're at the pharmacy counter, you don't know if it's a new or refill, or your technician doesn't always know if it's new or refill. So you make the offer to counsel all. Well, what does the law really say? And so that's where people get kind of tripped up, where the law says one thing, but what you do in retail is something totally different. How many of you work with a preceptor that said the way that they passed the exam was that they did everything opposite of what they do in real life in retail? Anybody ever say that? No? I actually asked the same question in Boston on Tuesday, and a few of the students shook their head and said, yeah, that's what their preceptor told them that they did to pass the exam. Now, what that tells me is that whatever you're doing in retail is 100% wrong. Correct? We'll also look at other issues today, and you'll say, oh, we never do that. And I guarantee you do it. It's just that you haven't really unpackaged the full appreciation of what you're doing in retail or in the pharmacy world. So, for example, One of the requirements is that on refill prescriptions, you're supposed to pull the hard copy, and on back of the hard copy, you're supposed to write the date, the quantity dispensed, and the pharmacist's initials who dispensed that. How many of you work in retail, and how many of you actually pull the hard copies? So I see one person. How about up in Manchester? Anybody up there do that? I don't see any hands up there, right? So I see one person out of a group of you down here. So what do the rest of you do? Well, it's all electronic. So realistically, you may not pull the hard copy, right? But when you read the law, it says you're supposed to pull the hard copy, right? But then there's usually a carve-out that says you can do electronic record-keeping requirements. So what is the electronic record-keeping requirements? You got to keep it 5 or 10 years or something like that? I don't know, right? Should be a review. You should have everything off the top of your head, right? How long do you keep records? Depends on both federal and state law, right? But how long is your normal record-keeping requirements?
4 years.
I hear 10. I hear how many up there?
4.
4 years, okay? So you're going to hear a whole slew of different answers. You're going to hear 2 years. You're going to hear 10 years. You may hear 4 years. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to defer that to state law, right? Where do you hear the 10 years? The 10 years is for Medicare. So if you have a patient who is on Medicare, that Medicare prescription needs to be retained for a period of at least 10 years. Now in Mass, what's the normal record-keeping requirement time period? In Mass, it's usually 2 years unless there's something else. How about New Hampshire? How long do you keep your prescription records?
4.
Okay, 4 years. See, Mass is 2, New Hampshire is 4. So what happens at the end of the 2 or 4 year period? You toss all your prescription records and then you get Medicare audited. What do you normally do? You keep the stricter of the 2, and so you always keep it longer than the 10-year period, or longer than the 2 year period of time. But what you also have to do is keep in mind that the answers on your test may be 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, right? So you got to answer the questions according to your state law and know what the state law and how it is that they apply. Okay. How about requirements for the distribution and dispensing of non-prescription products, including controlled substances? What are some of the requirements for that? Can you dispense a prescription to a doctor's office via a written prescription for the doctor's office use? So a doctor calls up and says, I need to get some drug. I need to get cocaine from your pharmacy. First off, what schedule is cocaine? I hear 1. Realistically, real life, MPJE, it's a schedule 2. You got to know the drugs. You got to know the schedules. Why? They give you the drugs. They say, here's a prescription. What are the rules for that? Right? So why is cocaine a Schedule 2 and not a Schedule 1? I see people looking at me like it's a foreign concept, right? But I know I cover that in pharmacy law. Cocaine has a medicinal use. There is a medical purpose for cocaine. What is it? It's usually a local anesthetic, and sometimes doctors use it for kids who go in for tubes in their ears. You have to compound it in a manner that you can't get the powder out of the cocaine again, right? The solution, but cocaine technically is a Schedule 2. Okay. So you're going to need to know, well, under what circumstances can you provide a doctor that prescription product? Can you, as a retail pharmacist under federal law, provide the doctor prescription medications? The answer is what? Should be a review. We had these posted for a couple weeks now. The answer is yes. But you can't do it under a prescription. Office orders are not a valid prescription. Remember, corresponding responsibility needs to be a legitimate medical purpose for an actual patient, and there's the doctor acting within their scope of practice. Remember all that? Yeah. You're going to have to unfold everything and to remember everything once again, right? And to try to apply this. How about record-keeping requirements? How about you get a prescription? How are you supposed to handle those prescription records? Well, you have a way to file the prescriptions, right? But do you keep them in the open? Are they in a safe? How do you handle that? Yeah, you have it in a file cabinet, right? Now, what about patient confidentiality? What's the federal rule or law which talks to the issue of patient confidentiality? HIPAA. What's the initials for HIPAA? It's HIPAA. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's not HIPPA. Okay? I don't think they'll ask that on the MPJE or anything like that, but at least you know HIPAA deals with confidentiality, right? What are some rules of HIPAA?
Are you coming Saturday?
I didn't hear that. What was that? In Manchester? So what are some rules of HIPAA? What do you need to have and know about HIPAA? Are pharmacies affected by HIPAA? Yes. Why are they affected by HIPAA? They're deemed to be a
covered entity.
Covered entity. Okay, a covered entity needs to comply with HIPAA. What are some requirements that your pharmacy has as it relates to compliance with HIPAA?
You have disclosure form.
Okay, so under HIPAA, there's two parts really, right? There's privacy and there's security, right? The privacy part requires you to have a privacy notice. And when a patient comes into your store, you're supposed to disclose what? How you'll use, store, and disclose patient information. So you need to get the patient's HIPAA authorization, correct? Under the security part, you have a few issues. Your computer system, you need to keep it in a confidential manner. How do you do that? Passwords and user IDs, right? Can I log into the computer system using your ID? The answer is no. A, it's a violation of HIPAA. B, it's probably a violation of your company policy, right? But also when you look at HIPAA, you also need, when you log into the computer system, the covered entity needs to provide and have a record of any access to a person's medical information. So every time you access a patient's profile, you're putting your electronic fingerprint in that profile. So when you look at security measures, procedures that are impacted there include your computer system, your use of passwords, the sharing of passwords. Okay? You also have, how do you destroy confidential information under HIPAA? How do you leave personal information, such as voicemails? So you need to know all this information, okay? So for example, how do you destroy protected health information? Well, what is the protected health information? It's patient's name, anything that identifies them, right? It could be iris scan, it could be a fingerprint, it could be a driver's license number. Okay? So when you look at information, one of the things that happens is a patient may bring a prescription vial into your store, right, for a refill. How do you get rid of that? How do you dispose of that? What do you do in your pharmacy? I hear people saying they put it in their shredding bag or bin. What do you do up in Manchester?
Burn it.
Yeah.
Burn it? Wow. That's violating the Clean Air Act. Hopefully you're not serious, but geez, right?
I'm staring at her.
They're serious. Do you hear that one? Seriously, how do you destroy protected health information? So you have a shredder, right?
No.
What type of shredder do you have in your store?
Don't.
You hire someone.
You hire someone.
Okay, so you hire someone.
Yeah.
So the company that you hire, what are they called? Under HIPAA, not the actual name of the company. What are they called under HIPAA?
Third party.
They're called a business associate. And in order for you to comply with HIPAA, your pharmacy should have a business associate agreement. Okay? So when these companies come in and they dispose of your trash, or the protected health information, what they do is they'll come in, they look like security guards, right? They almost carry guns, but they don't. They have badges and things like that, right? One of the companies in Boston that we use at our hospital is Shred It. They'll come in and they'll take it. All the bins are actually, I work in a research area and I don't have protected health information, but since I'm in a hospital, we have the bins there, right? And we still have the people coming in, and they'll come in and take our confidential information, they'll shred it, and basically they'll shred it in a manner such that somebody can't put that information back together. So those of you that are working in, let's say, an independent pharmacy, and you have a shredding machine there, right? What type of shredding machine do you use?
Cross shredder.
It should be a cross shredder, not the ones that come out and do it in a ribbon. Why? The ones in a ribbon, technically, somebody can sit there and re-paste all that information back together again. So that would be a violation of HIPAA. Why am I talking about HIPAA? Because pharmacists do get in trouble for violating HIPAA, and violating HIPAA in a manner in which they don't properly dispose of trash. How many of you work in a pharmacy chain that has 2 different colored trash bags? So you have one for regular trash and a different color for HIPAA information, right? Why do you have that?
Yes, I know.
What's that? It costs money for them in the regular trash? No? You put regular trash in the blue bins or whatever? Yeah. Why do you have the 2 different color bins? Because your pharmacy, guarantee, got hit with a HIPAA violation, which probably resulted in millions of dollars in fines. How does that normally happen? A person takes a vial, throws it in the trash. You have the patient's name on there. Now somebody can go dumpster diving and find your patient's information. And that is a disclosure of protected health information. Okay? When you leave messages on the phone, you have to be careful on voicemail, right? Because you don't know if you're leaving it at the right address. You don't know if others will hear that information. Okay? So you see a lot of different issues with HIPAA, federal law there. So practice, the day-to-day practicing constitutes a large area. There's also other areas in pharmacy that you'll need to know. A few of them relate to USP numbers here, and you'll see USP 800. That's the handling of hazardous materials. You'll probably cover that in your pharmaceutics lab. It usually corresponds to 2 other famous USPs. What are the 2 other famous USPs that you probably heard ad nauseum throughout your careers here? 795 and 797. So those of you, even though when you look at the materials that we have posted for the review, let me give you another piece of advice here. USP. How many of you have read the USP? Volumes or sections 1 through 999. Nobody yet? Well, here's the nice thing that you need to know. And we talked about it in law, if you can remember, right? Anything below 1,000 in the USP is what? It's enforceable as a regulation. And a lot of times, the boards of pharmacy have included one little sentence in their Pharmacy Practice Act. And in the afternoon, I will show you that one little sentence in the Pharmacy Practice Act, which includes that you need to comply with the applicable sections of the USP. Okay? And so basically what they're saying is you need to comply with the current edition of the USP. So one of the things that are out there is 797, 795. We know those are hot topics right now. 800. Right? We know that 800, the handling of hazardous materials. It's a newer regulation that's still going through some rulemaking, right? But it falls in line with compounding. And you should be aware of USP 800 as well. So the large chunk of the exam comes in the area of pharmacy practice. Okay? The smaller chunks come into areas of licensure and registration, certification requirements, and operational requirements. Okay? So some of those would be, how do you get licensed? What's the passing score of the MPJE, et cetera, et cetera. And then the application of regulations is 2% of the exam. So you see the breakup. And what I would do is I would refer you back to taking a look at the MPJE bulletin that's posted on Blackboard for you to get that information. Now you're going to say, how do I study for this? Right? Well, technically you need to know all laws, rules, and regulations. And one of the things I will tell you is that when you look at the federal packet, when you look at the federal packet, hopefully this isn't the first time you're seeing this, but you log in, and then you'll go under the federal packet at least. The first thing that pops up would be a letter from the Mass Board of Pharmacy. Now, if you're not taking the Mass Board of Pharmacy exam, just bear with me. But how many of you are taking the MPJE for Massachusetts? I see about half of you taking it down here. Not that many. I don't think anybody in New Hampshire is taking it in there. Okay? But you'll see one of the reference materials I will refer you to. It's to contact the State Board of Pharmacy in the state in which you're seeking licensure and to see what they recommend that you need to know and to study for the MPJE. When we look at the mass part, and you can download this, you'll have access to Blackboard for how long? What is it, 90 days after? Okay. So one of the nice things here is that it's in, you can like click any of these links and the links actually do work. Okay. And what I tried to do for the Massachusetts as well as the federal part was to actually put this in the folders for you instead of having you to go through and find all this yourself. Okay. But when you go through this letter, you'll see how long the exam is. You'll see all these references, what you're supposed to study. We're going to go through this a little bit more in the afternoon. But take a look at the state boards to see what information they have. Now, what happens if you're not taking it in Mass or New Hampshire? What states or what's some of the resources that you can do? You can call the Board of Pharmacy in that state to see what they have. You can also contact maybe one of the pharmacy schools in that state to see if they have any review. You know, you may be able to contact a colleague who's another intern that went to one of the state schools to see if they have any information, right? Other references that you're going to do, you know, you're going to want to take a look at the DEA's website, the FDA's website, and the like. But there are some references as well. Okay? So one of the references, you have the packet. And one of the things I'd like to do with the packet is that with that packet, you've seen that twice. Okay? The packet that's on the Massachusetts website is actually the same packet that we use for pharmacy law. And when I do pharmacy law, the reason why I do and teach pharmacy law that way is because I gear you towards taking and reviewing the material at least once for taking the MPJE for Massachusetts. And the same would go up there for New Hampshire as well. But there's some references as well. You know, there's going to be, you're going to need to know everything, right? So one of the things is take a look at your textbook. The pharmacy practice and the law text. Now, when you had it, you probably had a different text. There's now the 8th edition. Do you need to have the most current edition of the law books and texts and things like that? My answer is yes. Why? Things change all the time, right? Since the time that you had me for pharmacy law, which was how many years ago?
Almost 3.
Almost 3 years ago. So what happened in the 3 years? We've seen the full exposure of pharmacy compounding, right? We've started to see more states regulating for sterile compounding, non-sterile compounding. We also started to see more states regulating for non-resident pharmacies. We've seen outsourcing facilities in the FDA, correct? You have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Because you forget law once you take the class. Like the bowling alley, you go down and you do your pins, and at the end of your 2 balls, you hit the reset button and you forget everything. Hopefully not. Hopefully you learned more from your rotations, because that's one of the things that helps you when you are exposed to the law, is that when you're out on your rotations, hopefully you saw what a 222 form looks like, right? When you're out on your rotations, how many of you have never seen a 222 form? Everybody in New Hampshire saw it. They didn't raise their hands. But a couple of you down here never saw a 222 form? Wow. Okay. Well, now's your chance to look it up and take a look and see in the textbook what it is, right? Other references. You'll see a couple of them out there. There's the Pharmacy and Federal Drug Law Review from Coast Guard and Pisano. That's a little bit aged right now. That's about 7-8 years. There's the Guide to Federal Pharmacy Law, and let me just try to get you some pictures of what these things look like here, right? So the textbook, the current edition of the Pharmacy Practice and the Law, is from Abood and Burns. It's in the 8th edition. It's Pharmacy Practice and the Law. Since I use this in my pharmacy classes, it is on reserve at the library, so I don't know how long you may have ability to take a look at that. But when you look at it, you know, you go through that. You'll see Chapter 2 deals with all of the federal drug laws. So you see a nice review of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the different amendments, right? And remember, that does count for some of the exam. And just as a review, what's the Durham-Humphrey Amendment?
Refills.
What did the Durham-Humphrey Amendment do?
Refills.
Allow for refills. Is that it? Hopefully not. Not generic, but what it did was it allowed for the creation of prescription versus over-the-counter, right? It allows for generics, or allowed for refills. It also allowed for electronic prescribing, even though it was in the 50s. And it was way before fax machines and computers. How about the Kefauver-Harris Amendment? So review. We all should have had this stuff, right? Anybody look at the materials? No? Nobody looked at the materials that were posted, okay? All right. Kefauver-Harris Amendment. What that did was you had the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the original act from the 1930s, right? Just required safety. Kefauver-Harris Amendment came in after thalidomide, and it required the efficacy requirements. It also establishes informed consent, good manufacturing practice, right? Other materials that you can use to study. There are some good ones out there. For the Guide to Federal Pharmacy Law from Reese and Hall, these are instructors that teach pharmacy law in, I believe, at Albany College of Pharmacy. What this textbook does, it provides a review of the federal drug laws, and then it gives you some questions after each of the chapters. Okay? So it does provide a brief overview of the various sections of the federal drug laws, and then there's some questions. And then at the very end, there's about another couple hundred questions to help you reinforce the concepts in the textbook. Okay? And then another text that are out there is the Pharmacy Law Textbook and Review, and this one does provide more questions for you to do. And that's the whole thing here. I'm not saying that these are MPJE word-for-word questions, but what they do is that they help you read a concept, and then you're tested on this material that's out there. Okay? And one of the things I don't do is I don't ask the students for exam questions and different things like that, because in Massachusetts and in other states, that's a form of cheating. So when I do my review, one of the things I do is I show you the regulations. I expect you to review the regulations and know the laws. And then when you're taking these exams, you'll be able to apply the law and how they unpack and how they are supposed to be answered. Okay? So there's some references out there as well for your review. So this morning, the overview, what we will try to do is to go through, and we'll spend a considerable amount of time on the Controlled Substance Act. We'll go through, from the federal side, the Controlled Substance Act, and we'll go through the schedulings of drugs, because when I asked the question earlier, what schedule is cocaine, I saw the hands raised, and that was a Schedule 1. We'll go through that. We'll go through the Poison Prevention Packaging Act. What is the Poison Prevention Packaging Act? Prescription Prevention Packaging Act is the child caps, child-resistant caps, right? That's when do you use a child-resistant cap? When do you use the easy-off cap? What are the rules for the easy-off cap? What are the drugs that are exempt from the easy-off cap? What about blister packing for iron tablets? That's all falling under the Poison Prevention Packaging Act. How about the Prescription Drug Marketing Act? What's the key provision there? What's that? So the Prescription Drug Marketing Act refers to drug samples and distribution of samples, and also the registration of wholesalers by the various pharmacy boards. How about recalls? How many of you read the newspapers? How come nobody reads newspapers? So you're telling me you study all the time. So that means you should have read the material for the MPJE, all the materials before coming to class. Right? So recalls. Why am I talking about recalls? So you had the EpiPen recall, right?
Yes.
Big issue? Small issue? It could be a big issue. Why? Because it's a life-saving medication, right? But there's recalls. What do you know about recalls? There's different kinds. How many different kinds? There's 3 levels or 3 classes, right? Class 1 is your most serious, and then class 3 is your least serious, and somewhere in between it's the class 2 where it's and we'll go through the slides later on, but it's somewhere in between killing somebody and not killing somebody, okay? It's what they call medical reversible errors, okay? Recalls only happen in medical drugs and devices or anything else. It happens in foods, right? So why do I tell you to read the newspaper? Because there's a lot of pharmacy stuff hitting the news recently. Or things that you'll say, oh, I know about recalls, right? But it's not realistically relating to drugs. It's relating to foods. So one of the major supermarkets just issued a recall because their supplier had what in their food?
Syria.
It was a potato brand. What happened in the potatoes? There was found a golf ball. So they had to recall the food, right? So it happens. But when we look at it, it's the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, so that's why there's recalls in there, right? So what happens under a recall? So you got the 3 levels. What's supposed to happen? We just look at it and say, whatever, right? No, you're supposed to look at the recall, see if you have the stock bottle on hand. And then if you have the stock bottle on hand, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to check for the lot number, the expiration date, right? Now, how many of you record the lot number on a prescription? Probably nobody requires a lot number, correct? So what happens if that drug that's being recalled is a fast mover and you have 1 bottle on your shelf and it's an open bottle and there's only 1 tablet missing? Who do you call?
Everyone.
You call everyone that received that product because you can't be guaranteed who received it and who did not. So the issue with recalls is that the buyer or the seller notifies the buyer notifies downline, right? So the manufacturer has a recall. They notify the pharmacies, they'll notify the hospitals, they'll notify the wholesalers. They'll send out a letter. Then you go and you check your product to see if you have it on the shelf. And then what you'll then do is you'll notify anybody that you sold that to. That's your customers. How about your pharmacists? Are you responsible for knowing about all drug recalls? The answer is yes. You'll have a company policy about that, but as a pharmacist, you're responsible for knowing about all recalls. Then we have 2 issues under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We got misbranding and adulterated drugs. What's the difference?
Tylenol and IV.
So tell me a little bit about misbranding. Misbranding means what? What's the definition of misbranding? There's something false or misleading on the label, right? So normally when we look at the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, we're looking at it towards the drug manufacturers. But how can a pharmacist be responsible or held responsible for misbranding? You gave the patient the wrong drug. Okay, that's an example of misbranding. What's an example, go specifically on misbranding? By giving the right drug, could you give me an example of giving the right drug as being an example of misbranding?
Brand is generic for vice versa.
Yep. So one issue is if you don't transcript the prescription as the doctor writes, that could be misbranding. Another example is where, generics. You pulled the wrong generic and you didn't have the NDC number matching what you billed the insurance or what's on the label. So, for example, your insurance or your label says that you should have been using the Watson brand, and in your pharmacy you don't have enough of the Watson brand, so you pulled the Teva brand. to fill that prescription without changing the NDC number. That is an example of misbranding. Okay? Another example of misbranding is where you fill a prescription without the doctor's authorization. Oh, we never do that. Okay? I'll give you an example for you. And just bear with me for the New Hampshire people. In Mass, when do Schedule 6 controlled substances expire? They don't have an expiration date. When do they expire in your pharmacy's computer system? After 1 year. Okay? Why is it 1 year in your pharmacy computer system? It could be a number of factors. It could be the insurance system, right? But if I pay cash, why does your computer system box me out after 1 year? I didn't bill insurance for it. I paid cash, right? So what happens is that it's a good practice. After 1 year, if the patient didn't use the refills, probably they should see the doctor for examination or for a reevaluation if they need that product or not. Okay? So I come into your store and I ask for my ibuprofen 600 milligrams. And I had a year's refills on it, but I only used one refill. And what do? I ask you for a refill. And what do you tell me? Oh, he's the pharmacy law guy. He knows the law. He's going to come back to me and tell me that I can't fill it. And then the only reason I know is I can't use it's the law, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to regenerate that prescription. Can you legally regenerate that prescription with refills without contacting the doctor? The answer is no. What if you did? That's misbranding. Okay? Why is that misbranding? It's because you have a new pharmacy prescription number and you never called the doctor. That's misbranding. Anybody ever do that? I don't want to see hands. Adulterated drugs. What's an example of an adulterated drug?
Touch them with your hands.
Okay? So we have products that are not held in conditions according to the label requirements or according to USP requirements, right? So it's not held, it's held in conditions that aren't appropriate according to its labeling. Other issues would be where there's some dirt that's added to the product. So 2 examples that I will give you is that the drug is supposed to be refrigerated, but it's not in a refrigerator. It's held on your pharmacy shelf. Is that misbranded or adulterated? It's adulterated. Another example is an OxyContin falls on the floor. You find it after working your 12-hour shift. It's got a dust bunny on it. You blow the dust bunny off. And what do you do with that product that fell on the floor? You put it back into the stock bottle. You've now contaminated all of the remaining stock bottle tablets that are in there. What you're supposed to do is segregate it out, quarantine it, and then if it's a controlled substance, at the end of your year period of time or whenever you're destroying that product, you would get rid of it that way. Okay? How do you do your record keeping with your bound book for your perpetual C2s for that instance? You would do the minus, you'll make a notation where it is in the book and what happened. Okay? If you don't log it in the book, what's going to wind up happening is it's going to show that you're short one tablet. And somebody's going to be looking for it. So you have adulterated products, right? You have the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. How many of you read the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act? It's 2,000 pages. Okay? A lot of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act relates to manufacturers and how do you get that drug approved. So you have the IND, right? The investigational new drug application. You have the new drug application, right? You have the phases of a study. But you're going to say, what does that relate to the dispensing and the day-to-day functioning of the pharmacy? Well, that's the issue, is that they throw this concept at you that you're supposed to know everything. It's kind of like when you're driving a car and you get pulled over by the police officer, and the police officer says, do you know why I pulled you over? And you go, no, right? Or do they ask you the question is, do you know how fast you were going? And you're like, no, right? They can pull you over if you didn't use your turn signals, correct? Yeah. Marked lane violation or something to that effect, right? But when you look at this as a pharmacist, you're held to know all laws, rules, and regulations relating to the practice of pharmacy. Right? That's thousands of pages. You better get studying right now, right? So when you print out the material, anybody print out the materials for today? Yeah? Printed them out. How much of a material? No? Oh, just the basics? When you print everything out, it comes out to be about, if you don't do front and back, about 1.5 feet of material. And then you'll ask me, can I have the slides? And I say no. And the reason why I say no is because when I put the slides together, all I do is I go through, let's say, the Controlled Substance Act. I'll go through the pharmacist manual, and I'll cut and paste those sections. And basically, if you have the pharmacist manual, when we go through the Controlled Substance Act, you'll go through the different sections, and you'll see a rhythm to why I'm going in a certain manner. Why? Because it follows the materials there. Okay? And that's the secret with my slides. All the slides come from the material. And the reason I do that is that for today, there's 800 slides. There's no way that I'm going to have you print out 800 slides when all the material is here and you're supposed to know it anyway. Okay? And not only that, but then you'll say, oh, you skipped this little small section and it was all on my exam. And I'm like, nope, you're supposed to read the laws, rules, and regulations, right? You get the idea there. You'll see other issues with labeling directions, what needs to be on the label. How about package inserts? So what types of patient package inserts are there? What types of other inserts are there that happens? So you're working in a pharmacy. What are some examples of drug information that's available to you in a pharmacy? Without going on like Micromedics or like facts and comparisons or something like that. Where do you find information about a drug? You can find it on the drug's monograph, right? So how many monographs do you normally get for the drug? Usually you get one, right, per drug. Can you give that drug information sheet, the packaged drug insert sheet to the patient? No. Why not? You could. Is there a legal prohibition against giving the packaged drug insert to the patient? No. The reason you normally don't is because as soon as you open it, you toss it. Okay? You can go on to the FDA's website and find the FDA-approved the packaged drug insert for that. So you have that. How about those information sheets that print out in your pharmacy? You know those little information sheets about the name of the drug, how it's taken? That information sheet about how the drug is taken, is that counseling? No. So by giving that information sheet, it's not a substitute to counseling, correct? It's a tool to help the patient read the information about their drug if they weren't counseled. Or if they're counseling, you can use it as a tool to assist you in the counseling. I also heard medication guides. How many drugs require a medication guide? Oh, a lot, right? So now the question is, well, yeah, you kind of got to get out of jail card with pharmacy law for that, right? But now it's the real time. Now it's where you're practicing as a pharmacist. What drug do you use or that you're required to provide a medication guide for? You know these all off the top of your head? And the way I can see this happening is that I can make a question that says, medication guides are required for which of the following drugs, and list 15 different drugs, right? And you have to select all that's applicable. So you have to know all the drugs that require a medication guide. So what drugs require a medication guide? We'll get to this a little bit later, but let me show you how you find it. Where do you find that information? Where do you find drugs that require a medication guide? FDA website. You go to fda.gov. You go on to the fda.gov, you're there. Right? So what we can do, which we can do it a couple different ways. We can click on drugs. We can go down and search for medication guides, and you see it under drug safety. And we'll take another link here. And then when we go through the link, right, you're going to see the following drugs requiring a medication guide. You ready for it?
So everything.
Yeah, good luck studying all that list, right? Seriously, that could be exam material. So what you're going to do is you're probably going to find a way of trying to package this information. What's Frankhauser rule number 3? You don't remember that from pharmacy law? Don't remember that. Manchester, I don't expect you to know this one, right? But for those of you that have me for the mass law, one of the things I told you is how do I remember the dates in which a pharmacist license expires versus the store's license? Remember I told you a different way of studying that and how I remember it? The store has an O and the employee has an E in it, right? So the store expires on the, and this is only for mass, not up in New Hampshire unless you're taking a mass, right? So in the odd year, the store's registration expires on December 31st. On the even year, it's the pharmacist because they're the employee. And then we also kind of debunked that by saying that employee also has an O in it and store also has an E in it. But it made me remember it. And to this day, 3 years later, you remember that same Frankhauser rule number 3. Good luck to you on that one, right? So here's what we could do on this. You can look at these drugs, and you could probably put them into different classes. It would have been better, but I don't think the FDA can do this, right? It would have been better if the FDA's medication guides could have been put into a nice little setting like NSAIDs or SSRIs or something like that, because you'll look at common themes in here. And you'll see in here that, how many of you have ever dispensed Motrin? Right, every day? You hand out a medication guide every day?
Yeah.
Hopefully you do. Why? Because Motrin is a drug that requires a medication guide. And so what are some of the rules for dispensing a medication? Do you have to do it all the time, or is it just on the first dispensing for that? Okay, so you need to know the rules on that one. Okay? But you'll see other, like a lot, you'll see Voltaren in there, you'll see naproxen in here as well. Okay? So there are a lot of different drugs that you're held responsible for knowing. How about in lab? Did they ever ask the question on medication guides or anything about in your counseling monitoring points or anything like that? No? Okay. It's good to know, but that's how you unpack and that's how you understand these things and concepts too, right? You'll also see tamper-resistant prescriptions. What's a tamper-resistant prescription? When do you use a tamper-resistant prescription blank? Well, first off, we're going to have to look and see what your state law requirements are for it. But tamper-resistant prescriptions are required when? When are they required under federal law? They're required under federal law when the patient is on Medicare or Medicaid. Patient's on Medicaid, right? So when you look at a tamper-resistant prescription blank, tamper-resistant prescription blank has what characteristics? They have a water stamp, okay? They have... Anybody ever see a tamper-resistant prescription blank? Hopefully yes. Yeah? Never? Serious? Come on, you got to. Maybe you just don't know what they are, right? Here's an example of a tamper-resistant prescription blank. They have a serial number on it. Can it be the same serial number for every prescription the doctor writes? No, right? There's actually, it's like a doctor asked that question, can I just use the same serial number? I'm like, no, it has to be a different serial number for each prescription. Okay? What are some other examples? Well, let's take a look at it from something that's comparable. What's comparable to a tamper-resistant prescription blank? A check. Okay, so when we look at a check, let's pretend that that's a prescription blank. A tamper-resistant. Does it have a special number on it? Yeah, it's got like its serial number, right? Each check has its own number. What else? What's your checks look like? You got what color background? White? Or it may be like a color background, correct? So why do you think there's a color background on a check? Well, there's photocopiers that make copy colors now, right? So that's maybe not the reason. The reason is that if you write it in pen and somebody needs to make an erase on it, what does that color change to? Probably changes to white or something else, right? So you can see when somebody makes an erasure on a different color background. Another example is what? When you make a photocopy, the word void or duplicate pop through, right? Which is an interesting concept because sometimes when you receive a fax from a doctor's office, Sometimes the doctor writes the prescription out and uses their actual prescription blank, and then they fax it to you, and then what happens? The word void comes through. What if you fill it? You can't. Why? Because that's not a legitimate fax prescription, because the word void comes through or duplicate comes through. Are those all the markings of a tamper-resistant prescription blank? One more. There's one more. Think of a check. Not really a logo. Think of it, flip the check over. You have some type of secure method where you put your finger over something where the heat activates something that may look like it looks invisible, but then when you wipe your finger over, it turns pink, right? Something like that. That's a tamper-resistant prescription blank requirement. Okay? Multiple C2 prescriptions under federal law. Okay? When do C2s expire under federal law? So let's assume that your state applies strictly federal law. And also keep in mind that in the event of a conflict between state and federal law, the stricter of the laws apply. Okay? So under federal law, C2s don't have an expiration date. Okay? Can you have refills on a C2? The answer is no. So what we do is we come up with this multiple issuance of C2 prescriptions. So tell me the rules as it relates to multiple C2 prescriptions.
Separate blanks.
You need separate blanks for each prescription. Okay, that's one rule. Rule number 2 is what? They need to be dated on the date in which the doctor or prescriber wrote the prescription. You cannot predate or postdate prescriptions. Okay? Rule number 3. Do not fill before date. That's a mass law. We'll talk about that in mass. Why is that a mass law? Because in mass, C2s expire 30 days from the date that they're written. And so in order to comply with the multiple issuance, you need a do not fill before date, which turns into the date written of when you count the 30 days. So it wouldn't be that under federal law, but rule number 3 is what? What's that? You can only have 3 of them. Work with me and unpackage that a little bit more. 3 of what? 3-month prescriptions. So the limit there is a quantity limit of 90 days. Okay? So when we look at multiple issuance of C2s, you know the rules. What are the 3 rules again? It's dated on the date that the prescription was written. It's not predated and not postdated. It's what? Separate blanks for the prescriptions and maximum of a 90-day supply. Now, here's where we're going to look at some rules. For C2s, what's the maximum day supply that you can dispense on a C2?
30, except for ADHD and narcolepsy.
90 days.
So the maximum amount you say is 30, right? But technically it should be a 30 with a star. And the star is for certain drugs, like methylphenidate and Adderall. You can go up to a 60-day supply. Okay? And also for an implantable infusion pump, you can go up to a 90-day supply. Okay? So now the question is you get a prescription for methylphenidate, X strength, whatever it is. Quantity of 60 with the directions, take 1 tablet a day. And then you get 2 other prescriptions, exact same directions for use. Can you fill those prescriptions under the multiple issuance of C2s?
Only the first one.
The answer is you could fill the first one, no problem. How about the second one?
Post-date.
The second one, you cannot fill more than the 30 days. Why? Because it would exceed the 90-day time period. Okay? So now what do you have to do?
Void 30 days.
You now have what they call a partial fill of a C2. Okay? So under the partial fill of a C2, what are your requirements?
The remainder.
You're going to need to void out the remaining amount and contact the prescriber. How many of you work in a store that doesn't care about that and they just keep filling the 60, 60, 60 without even looking at their multiple issuance? You probably see them every once in a while. Okay? To know the law and know the rules there. okay? We're going to talk briefly about alcohol. Some states allow pharmacies to sell alcohol for medicinal purposes. And then I'm just going to have one brief slide on Ipecac. And the reason I talk about that is because there could be some medication safety issues as it relates to Ipecac syrup versus Ipecac fluid extract. And I just want you to be aware of the differences. In the state law part, you're going to follow your Pharmacy Practice Act. So even though you're going to say, oh, I'm not going to stay for Mass, I'm not going to stay for New Hampshire, I'm not going to care about that, right? One of the things that you're going to need to know is you're still going to need to know the Pharmacy Practice Act for the state in which you're going to work in. So one question that I have is, what tools do you have available to you to find at a snapshot your Pharmacy Practice Act, or at least some requirements that can help and assist you in studying for the state law review? Besides this posted material for today, did the school provide you with any other access to Pharmacy Practice Acts throughout the states? Anybody look at Blackboard? Take a look at Blackboard. Okay, let's take a look at Blackboard. And let's see here. We don't have it in the pharmacy material for today. Do you see anything else that may have the word law on Blackboard? Anybody click this yet? Nope. It's been there for at least a month. Probably like, I'm not studying yet. I don't need to know this stuff. I'm going to graduate first. Oh, and that's one thing I forgot to tell you. I always start out by going, congratulations. And I forgot to do that today, right? But let me take this first minute to say congratulations. You made it, right? You're going to graduate in 2 days, right? You've made it. You felt good about yourself, right? Now the honeymoon's going to be over after graduation because now you got to start to study. You got to start to study for the NAPLEX and MPJE. I don't care what anybody else says. Study for that MPJE, right? But when you look here, and you'll see here the pharmacy law, the survey of pharmacy law. What this is that it's a survey of all 50 states, including three of the jurisdictions, the District of Columbia, Guam, and Puerto Rico. What it does, it gives you at a snapshot certain questions that the boards of pharmacy were asked throughout the country. And you'll see the different questions that are asked in the survey, so you can help to use this as a study guide. So, for example, one of the things that you're going to need to be knowing about on the exam is, well, what's the board description? Or what's the board membership? So what you're going to do is you can print these out, use these as an outline for your studying, right? So in Mass, how many members are on the board, right? But just keep in mind that they're asking a specific question. What is the specific question that they're asking here about board membership? They're asking number of board members, right? So what you need to do is you need to go through the law and to see what the law says on the number of board members. And on here, what they're asking is like how many pharmacists and how many public, right? But in Mass, if they're just asking how many pharmacists or how many public members, that's all the boards are answering, okay? But in Mass, you know what else? You have, in addition to a pharmacist, who else do you have? You have a technician, you have a nurse, and you have a doctor, including and also in addition to the public members. Okay? So be careful when you're studying these things. And if somebody asks you how many pharmacists are on the Mass board or the New Hampshire board or whatever the case may be, that's what the questions are being asked for. But also supplement that with your background material. Okay? Also, you'll need to see here examination requirements. What are the exam requirements? Are there anything else that's required? And these are questions, and you relate to where it could account for 17% or so of the exam. So how do you get licensed as a pharmacist?
I'd rather make interest on that money now.
You have to at least take the NAPLEX, right? So you take the NAPLEX, and you go through the examination process. What's the normal passing score? 75. how long, let's say you score 76 on the law and you score 74 on the NAPLEX. Do they average them out? Nope. You need a 75 on both, right? So the question is, can you sign up for the NAPLEX the next day, or do you have to wait a period of time? You have to wait at least, 45 days for you to get another authorization to test. Okay? Other states may also say that you need to complete all requirements in a year period of time. So let's say, hypothetically, you passed the law part, and you didn't pass the NAPLEX, and it's close to a year. You may have to take both parts over again. Okay? But then you'll see other issues here, such as issues as it relates to your license requirements and also technicians. And so use this as a nice guide to help prepare for your outline and use it for answering questions. And you should have answers to each of these, right? So you should at least know. And then when you scroll down, the nice thing about this is that it does give you a snapshot of the answer, so you can at least know if you're doing right. Okay? So it gives you the answers there. Okay? So one example here is board membership. How long are the term in years? You'll see in New Hampshire, the board their term of years are 5. In Mass, the term of years is 3. Okay? So you see that's one of the reference materials that you should also be using for. If you plan on taking more than one state exam, what have they told you to do? What I would say and what I recommend that you do is you take one exam, put the hat on that you're taking the exam. Don't try studying the laws in 3 or 4 different states at the same time. Okay? I'm licensed in Mass and New York. Okay? As a Massachusetts pharmacist, there's certain things you could do in Mass that you can't do in New York. There's certain things you could do in New York that you can't do in Mass. Right? Don't get your brain cross-wired between the 2 different states, especially if you've never worked in all the states in which you're seeking licensure in. Okay? How many of you are planning on getting licensed in New York? No one? One? How about New Jersey? How about New Jersey and Mass? No? Just plain one state. 2 states? Okay. 2 states as well? How about up there in New Hampshire? 2 states? 3? Yep. Some of you want to get licensed in the tri-borough area or the tri-state area, whatever the case may be, right? What I do is I tell you to study the law for one state law first, wait a couple weeks, and then start off going to the different states and then just focusing in on that next state. Don't get confused. Okay? The laws all seem similar and they're not, especially if you've never practiced in the different states. Okay? So the afternoon, we'll look at the Pharmacy Practice Act. In your Pharmacy Practice Act for the state, you're going to find issues such as technicians. What are the technicians? What are their responsibilities? What are their duties? What about the licensing of pharmacies? How about wholesalers? What about nuclear pharmacists? What about interns? What are the requirements for interns and using interns and managers of record? Okay? CE requirements. All states have CE requirements. We're going to look at that. Also going to look at policies and long-term care. Okay? You'll look at the formulary. Some states have interchange, or other states have what they call generic substitution laws. You should be familiar with those. Also, what about prescription formats? Does your state require a specific prescription blank? So, for example, in Mass, you require a specific prescription blank. Needs to have certain things on there. The New York people, what's a New York prescription blank look like? Electronic? I didn't hear that.
Everything has to be electronic now.
Everything has to be electronic? Okay.
Unless they get exempted from it.
Unless they have some exclusion for that. Okay? So in New York, everything electronic. What about signatures for the doctor? If it's a handwritten prescription, can the doctor use a stamp for their signature? Mostly the answer will be no on that one, right? You'll see composition of the boards, other pharmacy requirements as it relates to the dispensing requirements. We'll look in the afternoon about the Board of Registration of Medicine because there are certain things you need to know about physician self-prescribing and prescribing for family members. And then we'll look at policies and long-term care. So how are we doing on time right now? How about we take a 5-minute break, come back, and we'll look at the Controlled Substance Act. Okay? They took the clock down.
I'm gonna be all up and down. See, he's sincere. I'm sincere. They're supposed to have some Honestly, I might go back to school and get my PhD. That's alright, I was like a dog. I like mine better.
Bailey, pat you down.
Oh, yeah. Sunblock?
No, doesn't. You have to like watch that like 1,000 times.
I'm getting Tom's country.
One song's not bad.
I don't know.
Elm Street's gonna be here. Elm Street's gonna Get down, get out soon.
Sorry, I just don't know water. Snack time ready?
Well, the text can't set pharmacist F.
I just use my.
What do you want? I've only
Yeah, that one's on just randomly pick one, right? Oh boy. He's always
Yeah, and then like go to the but yeah. He only has the email. Yeah, this is actually it's like
Okay, so let's get started back again. So now's the time that you can take a look at the pharmacist manual. If you don't have the electronic access to it, you can sit back and look at the slides, and let's try to figure out some of our questions here, right? So when we look at the Controlled Substances Act, we're going to always focus in here on the pharmacist manual. The reason for that is that how many pages is the actual substance? A lot, right? So it's a couple thousand pages, and it's broken up into different titles. You have one that relates to importing and exporting. We're not going to really focus in on that. You have one that focuses in on like the drug treatment programs. We're not going to focus in on that. We will highlight two areas. We will highlight things about dispensing under the Data Act. Remember the Data Act? Yeah? What's the Data Act then? I saw some head shaking. The Data Act relates to two drugs, right? Suboxone, Subutex, right? Anything special about Subutex and Suboxone? The doctor needs to have a special DEA number. Remember that? Begins with an X, right? How many patients can the doctor have in their portfolio? Starts out at 30 for the first year, go up to 100. Any criteria to be a qualified physician? Remember, qualified physician? They have that X as their DEA number. Qualified physicians, they need to do what? They need special training. What are the special trainings? They need to be board certified in addiction psychiatry or undergo 8 hours of some type of program in that area. Okay? Well, I'll go into more specifics shortly. The other drug that comes into play when we look at the issue of drug treatment is methadone. Okay? When we talk about methadone, I'll have a slide on that for you. But in the retail pharmacy, can you dispense methadone? Answer is yes. What is the maximum strength that you can have in the pharmacy? Is it the 5 or the 10 milligram? The 10 milligram strength? Okay. Can you have the 40 milligram in your pharmacy? No. Why not? That's reserved for the methadone clinics. Okay. You can't have that 40 milligram in your pharmacy. Okay. So when we look at the Controlled Substance Act, we're going to look at what agency. It's the DEA. I highly doubt that they're going to ask what the abbreviation DEA will be because you're supposed to know Drug Enforcement Administration. Same thing with FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. But the DEA is responsible for enforcing the Controlled Substance Act. And the Controlled Substance Acts are there to improve the administration, regulation, and manufacture, the import, export, distribution, and dispensing of controlled substances by providing a closed system for distribution. What is the difference between a closed system and an open system? Why is there a closed system? Only allow certain persons, and persons can be an individual or a company, to possess a controlled substance, right? So when we look at it from a manufacturer needs to have a registration. So manufacturers need to be registered with the DEA. Providers need to be registered with the DEA. When we talk about providers, we mean actual physicians, dentists, midwives, mid-level practitioners, physician assistants. Can a pharmacist obtain a DEA number? I see head shaking. No. How about New Hampshire? A few of you have dwindled out of there. How about New Hampshire? Can pharmacists obtain a DEA number? The answer would be yes. And the reason for that is that if your state allows, you may be able to enter into a collaborative drug therapy program with a physician. And if the state allows, you may be able to adjust doses of certain drugs. And we'll talk about that in state law as it relates to what you can do in Massachusetts as it relates to practicing under a collaborative drug therapy agreement. Okay? So in that instance, the pharmacist may need to have a DEA number. But generally speaking, 99.9% of retail pharmacists don't obtain one. So who obtains the DEA number for the retail setting? It's the pharmacy. Why? The pharmacy has the possession and control of that controlled substance. Okay? So at any given time, it's a closed system because you can tell who has the drug and where it is in the distribution system. And not only that, but in order for a patient to receive it, they need to have a prescription. Right? The prescription is kind of like a license to possess a controlled substance. Okay? So it's closed. You also need to note that there are special forms to order these DEA-controlled substances. Other items here is that federal drug control laws are designed to function in conjunction with or in tandem with the state boards of pharmacy. So usually if you have a state board of pharmacy inspection, they note a diversion issue, they will notify the DEA. And the DEA, if on one of their inspections they notice a controlled substance violation, they will most likely notify the applicable state board of pharmacy. And if you're stealing or diverting drugs, they can also notify the state police, as well as the federal police officers as well, okay? Which would be the DEAs in that instance. Okay? Other items to keep in mind is that if the state board revokes a license, the DEA's pharmacy registration will also be affected and will also be placed under a voluntary surrender. Okay? So, a few things here. We're going to talk about the scheduling of drugs. So under the Federal Controlled Substance Act, there are how many schedules of drugs? There are 5. Okay, Schedule 1 drugs, no accepted medical use. Okay? So when we look at the Federal Controlled Substance Act, Schedule 1 drugs, high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use in the United States. So in your pharmacy, you'll probably never see a prescription for heroin or LSD or marijuana, right? Under federal law, they are classified as Schedule 1 drugs. You'll also see here GHB with a couple of stars next to it. Why do you think that there's a couple of stars next to that? So in this instance, this GHB, what I want to highlight here, would be the GHB that's sold by the corner drugstore pharmacists out on the street corner. It's the illicit drug use, or it's the illicit drug. Okay? So the illicit drugs are usually also Schedule 1s. Another example for you was methamphetamine. What schedule of drug does methamphetamine fall under the Federal Controlled Substance Act? Methamphetamine is a Schedule 2. So in your pharmacy, if you possess methamphetamine, it's most likely manufactured by a legitimate manufacturer. It's registered by the DEA. Now the street corner pharmacist possesses methamphetamines manufactured by, what's the lab from Breaking Bad called? Is that Heisenberg lab or something like that, right? No. That is the illicit drug. Okay? That would be a Schedule 1. Schedule 2 drugs have a high potential for abuse. Now, when we look at Schedule 2 drugs, they do have a current accepted medical use. So you will receive a prescription potentially for this. In the retail pharmacy setting, what type of registration would a retail pharmacy possess from the DEA? What schedules of drugs would a retail pharmacist possess on their retail pharmacy license? 3 through 5? How about 2 through 5? Most likely it will be Schedules 2 through 5. Why not Schedule 1 in a retail setting? There's no accepted medical use. Okay? So therefore, if you look at 99.999% of retail pharmacy licenses, if they have a DEA registration, it would be for Schedules 2 through 5 controlled substances. Not all retail pharmacies may have a DEA registration. If that's the case, they cannot possess Schedules 2 through 5. Schedule 2 drugs include your morphine, your methadone, your oxycodone, your amylbarbital, cyclobarbital, pentobarbital. These are usually in a capsule form. Okay? The pharmacist manual also goes in, and just keep in mind, and here's one area where you're going to have to make a change in the pharmacist manual. The pharmacist manual was written in 2010. What happened between 2010 and 2017? Did any drug get rescheduled from a Schedule 3 to a Schedule 2? The answer is yes. What is it? It's the hydrocodone-containing products. Now, put a note on the front page or somewhere that hydrocodone-containing products are a Schedule 2. Okay, even though the manual says it's a Schedule 3, the reason for it, it's from 2010 and it hasn't been updated. So with Schedule 3 drugs, you'll also see that certain suppository dosage forms containing amylbarbital, cyclobarbital, and pentobarbital, or their salts, may be considered a Schedule 3 if it's in suppository form. The reason for that is who's going to abuse the suppository? Your Schedule 4s include your benzodiazepines, your pentazocine, your chlorohydrate, meprobamate. What drug's not on here? What's another example of a Schedule 4 drug? Caraspodal. Why is caraspodal a Schedule 4? See if you remember from pharmacy law. That was like one of the homework assignments I probably gave you. It's a type of part of the Trinity. What's the Trinity? Soma, the benzodiazepine, and maybe like, it could be one of the reasons. Probably one of the reasons for it is that it's part of a drug that's highly abused. But why a Schedule 4? Why not a 3? Why not a 5? The reason for it is that caraspodal, my understanding, is a prodrug, breaks down in the body into meprobamate. It's a muscle relaxant that way. Okay. While we're talking about little things like facts there for you, I have 2 drugs for you. I have Furanol and I have Furacet. What schedule does Furanol belong in? Furanol is what? Furanol is a Schedule 3. Right? And Furacet, under federal laws, are not regulated. Okay? So they're not a Schedule 6 under federal law because there is no such thing as a Schedule 6 under federal law. It's under mass law. Okay? So what's the difference between Furanol and Furacet? One, Furanol has aspirin. Furacet has acetaminophen. That's the only difference. Why is one a schedule and one not? You take Furacet with an aspirin, you technically now have Furanol. Why is one regulated and one's not? I doubt that they'll ask you this, but it's one of those fact picks out there that you'll know. Anybody ever noticed that before? Yeah. You ever wonder? The reason for it is that Furanol came on the market first, and Furacet came on the market afterwards, years after, and the government lifted its restrictions on the butalbital. And basically, long story short, it's just too expensive for the manufacturer of Furanol to go back because there's generics already available. So they said, why do we want to deregulate it when there's no benefit to deregulating it? Okay? So that's probably the best answer that I will give you for that, right? It's just the timing of when the drug came out. Okay? Schedule 5 products. If your state law allows, you can sell these products without a prescription. Maine. Who's from Maine? Nobody from Maine? Nobody going to be licensed in Maine?
Yeah.
Yeah? What about Maine? Can you sell Robitussin with codeine without a prescription?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
What's the requirements?
Over the counter.
What's the requirements?
Over the counter.
Besides over the counter, I mean, like, there's got to be something, right?
Like Sudafed.
Valid ID? That it? So I'm going to go to Maine tomorrow. I'm going to ask for Robitussin with codeine. I'm going to show an ID. I'll send my daughter in. She's 15. 14. No? Okay, what's the deal? The deal is you have to be at least 18 years of age, the purchaser. The pharmacist has to do that, the sale, right? The pharmacist also requires a bound book for the recording of that sale. And there's also sales limits of how much you can actually dispense or sell without a prescription. So there are rules as it relates to the over-the-counter sale. Mass, you can't do it. You need a prescription. But over-the-counter sales, if the state follows federal law and allows for it, you need a bound book. Okay, sale done by the pharmacist. And this is all in the pharmacist manual. And the quantity limits are usually 4 ounces in a certain period of time. Okay? Here's just a review type of question for you to see if you're paying attention. Suppository dosage form of cyclobarbital is likely classified in which of the following? Schedule 3, right? So you got your answer C there. Now we're going to start to see some different forms. Okay? So the question for you is on these different forms. Tell me all the forms there are that are related to controlled substance registrations. Which forms?
6106.
The 222. What's a 222 used for?
Ordering.
Ordering C2s. Any special things about a 222 form?
Triplicate.
So the paper is their triplicate. It's copy 1, copy 2, copy 3, right? You also can't make any mistakes. If you make a mistake, you have to void it out. And then, what do you do with the voided out copy? You keep it. Where do you keep it? You keep it together, usually in your safe, with other important documents. Other important documents include?
106.
Okay, well, we got the 106. That's a significant theft or loss of a controlled substance. What else? You have a Form 41 for your destruction of a controlled substance. You have the 224, which is to register with the DEA. And then also you need a special form. It's called what? A power of attorney. Power of attorney allows you to order and sign for the 222s, right? And the rationale behind that is that when you register with the DEA, the person who is registered with the DEA is automatically allowed to order and sign the 222 forms. Now, if you work in a big corporate chain, where do your registrations get sent with the DEA? Does it get sent to the store level? And the answer is no, right? It gets sent to corporate. So somebody in corporate signs all the renewal applications. So without a power of attorney, what that means is that somebody in corporate would have to go to every single store in the country every night and sign an application for to sign the 222 order forms if they didn't have a power of attorney. So what happens is that if you work in an independent pharmacy where you're the owner, you sign the most recent renewal or registration with the DEA, so you have the power to sign a 222 form. Now, if you don't and you want to assign others, you have to have a power of attorney. So who can have a power of attorney? It's usually the supervising manager of record, right? Manager of record or PIC, pharmacist in charge, whatever your state calls them. Who else? It could be another pharmacist. Can a technician have that? The answer is yes. Really? Yes, it's in the pharmacist manual. I like that when you all shake your head with confidence, no. And the answer is yes. It's fun. DEA registrations expire when? Every 3 years. Now, what I want you to do is, when we look at the mask part, you're going to see that included in the mask materials is actually a self-inspection. And one of the things is, if you're going to be a manager of record, one of the things you want to always check in your pharmacy is if they're up to date with their licenses and the like. Okay? So one of the things you should always check is to see if your technicians, if the state law requires that they be registered, to make sure that they have a current registration. Also to make sure that all your pharmacists have a current registration, that your store licenses are all up and good. Right? And while you're checking it, check your own license to make sure it's good. And while you're in your wallet or your purse, check your driver's license to make sure that your driver's license is also current. Right? Because what happens with at least the Commonwealth of Mass? Do they notify you in mail anymore of a license going to be expired?
Yes.
No, it's up to you to do that, right? Well, guess what? The DEA is also going towards that as well. It's up to the registrants to self-monitor to see if their inspection or if their registration's expired or not. So what, and this is interesting because in the news, and I know nobody reads the news, so I can just make this up. No, this is true, right? This is true. A couple months back, the DEA says that they're no longer going to be sending out renewals to the physicians, at least. And then there's such an outcry from the physicians saying, no, you should resend us the renewals. And then the DEA kind of rescinded that and said, okay, we'll continue to send it out. But stay tuned. They may decide not to send out the renewals again. And then that will be up to the registrants to make sure that they are having a license and a current registration. Okay? And so that's why I kind of turned it into check your driver's license, because, you know, that's what a lot of things are going to, that you self-regulate yourself there. Change of business, anytime you have a change of business, and a change of business could mean that you move addresses. So you move from one location to another. You have to let the DEA know. Okay? Sometimes the post office does some weird stuff. Sometimes what they do is that they change your address without you really knowing about it. Okay? If the post office changes your street address and notifies you, you have to also notify the DEA because you have a different address. Okay? So the DEA will then need to issue a new license. And it's your responsibility of the pharmacist to notify the DEA about any change of address before the effective date of your move. Same thing holds true for termination of registration. If you go out of business, or if you merge, or if you consolidate, whatever the case may be, you have to let the DEA know of this proposed termination. And one of the things that you have to do is that you have to return your DEA registration to the DEA, as well as any unused DEA 222 forms. On the unused 222 forms, you need to write the word void across them. Okay? Now, before you return your registration, what is it important that you have done? Before you return your DEA registration, it's important that what? All controlled substances have been transferred out of your possession. Okay? So the classic example is your pharmacy goes out of business and you sell your drugs to another store. Would the store acquiring your pharmacy and your business, would they want expired drugs? The answer is probably not. They'll buy your inventory of active drugs or in-date drugs, but they don't want your out-of-date drugs. Why? Because they have to pay to destroy them, but also it's your garbage to get rid of, right? So they probably won't want that. So how do you, when you transfer all the in-date drugs, that's fine. But when you have expired drugs, you also have to make sure that you get rid of those before you turn in your license and registration with the DEA. Because if you turn in your registration with the DEA and still have possession of an expired controlled substance, not a good thing. Okay? Other things that you need to know, and here's where you're going to start to look at some time periods. It's important that you notice this because of the fact that with the DEA, you have to notify the DEA at least 14 days before the proposed transfer. And you notify the DEA registration field office of your pharmacy's name and address, the pharmacy acquiring your information. Also, how will the business activities either be continued at the current location or will it be moved to a new location? So they want specifics. And they also want specifics on how the controlled substances will be transferred. So they want to know the security methods that you're using. Okay? On the day of the transfer, is there anything special you need to do?
Inventory.
You need to do your inventory. Okay? So the inventory of the pharmacy closing should be relatively easy because it should be all zeros. And then the acquiring pharmacy will then need to do an accounting for all of the controlled substances that they now currently have on hand. Now, and we'll have a slide on this later down the line, but since we're talking about controlled substance inventories, it's a special term for that. What's that term called? It's the biannual inventory, controlled substance inventory. So what are some rules of the biannual controlled substance inventory? It's done every 2 years. Is it done on the exact same day every year, every 2 years? The answer is no. It's sometime around the time that you register with the DEA, right? If you work in the ABC pharmacy chain, the chain may say you need to do the biannual inventory on this day, and everybody in the entire chain does it. Now, the second rule about the biannual inventory is what? You do it at lunchtime? When do you do it? You do it at close of business or at opening or before opening. And the reason is that you need to have a time period defined of when you can say how many controlled substances that are on hand. Because during the day, if you do it at lunch, the numbers are going to fluctuate up and down. So you either do it at beginning or before you open or at the end of the day. The other thing that you're supposed to do is what? Exact counts for Schedule 2s and what else? Exact counts for Schedule 2s and what else? And any open bottle of a Schedule 3 through 5 containing more than 1,000 tablets. If the bottles are less than 1,000, you can guesstimate. Okay? I, as a best practice, recommend that you don't guesstimate. I recommend that you do an exact count. And the reason for that is how good are you at shaking and saying, oh, there's 399 tablets in there? Probably not good, right? And here's the reason why I recommend as a good practice that you do it is because if you're the incoming manager of record, you only want to be responsible for things that happen to you. You don't want to be responsible for a theft or loss that wasn't reported to the DEA by somebody else's watch. Okay? One example I will give you on this is lorazepam, the 0.5 milligrams. How big are those tablets? They are very tiny, right? How big is the bottle? Oh, it's like a gallon size, right? Compared to the, relatively speaking, right? I mean, it's about maybe the size of the coffee cup, right? So when you open it up, you'll say, oh, I'm just going to shake it, and there's 49 tablets left in there, right? So the outgoing manager of record would say there's 499 in there. But you're the incoming manager of record, and you're like, no, I want the exact count. So you do the exact count, okay? So the reason for it is it's your license. You're responsible for that. Okay? Once you're done with the biannual inventory, what do you do? What do you do with that paperwork? Do you send it to DEA? No. You don't send it to DEA. Do you send it to corporate? Maybe. But what you need to do is you need to retain a copy in your pharmacy. And where do you file that? With your important paperwork, your 222 forms, your power of attorney. All this stuff needs to be there. Also, another important thing that you keep on file is if you are inspected by any of the agencies, especially the DEA, you want a copy of the last inspection. Why? Because they will ask you for the copy of the last inspection. So it's important that you have that readily retrievable so that you know where they are. Okay? Records of dispersal. This is any type of document that you have that documents that drugs are being shipped out of the store. So examples for that would be prescriptions. Prescriptions are your big answers there, right? Your 222 forms if you're shipping drug out to other stores. Okay? Invoices, records of loss or theft. Okay? Distributions from one pharmacy to another. Can you transfer under federal laws drugs from your pharmacy to another pharmacy? The answer is yes. Okay? What's the maximum amount? What is that rule called?
12%.
It's the 5% rule. Okay? Of a slide shortly on that. But the 5% rule is that you can transfer up to a maximum of 5% of controlled substances that you have dispensed in a year. Now the question is, how do you come up with the 5%? It's very gray of how you come up with that, but I will have a slide for you on that. Okay? The other important thing to note there is that you'll say that, no, we can't do it. You may say, no, we can't do it. Why? Because that may be a company policy. Okay? Company policy may prohibit you from doing that. So know the difference between a company policy and what the laws allow you to do. Okay? Which is why I said earlier you do everything opposite of what you do in real life. The reason for it is your company policy may say, no, you can't do it. But on the exam, it may say yes. Okay? So when you do distributions, you need to basically create an invoice. And when you create the invoice, name of the drug, the dosage form, the strength, the number of tablets that you're dispensing or transferring, the date distributed, as well as who's receiving that information. Okay? Now, when do you use an invoice? When do you use a 222 form? Do you use an invoice for everything? Answer is you don't use an invoice for everything, right? In order to properly transfer, you use an invoice under federal laws for Schedules 3, 4, and 5. If you're going to transfer a Schedule 2, you use a 222 form. Okay? Now, the question for you is, whose 222 form is being utilized? And who does what with the different copies? So let's take a look at filling out and executing a 222 form real quick. So let's look at it from the normal process. What is the normal process? You're the retail pharmacy, so you are considered the purchaser. Okay? You fill out the DEA 222 form. The DEA 222 form is 3 separate copies. You fill it out correctly, you don't make any mistakes. Okay? What copy does the purchaser retain at your level? The what color? So I hear light brown, I hear blue. Okay? So which copy do you retain at the pharmacy as the purchaser? You retain copy 3. You send copies 1 and 2 off to who? You send it off to whoever's providing it to you, right? You're the buyer, you're the purchaser. You're sending the 222 forms, copies 1 and 2, off to the seller. The seller then looks at your 222 form, makes sure that there's no mistakes or errors. They then do their due diligence by then doing what? Shipping you what you ordered. And then they retain a copy. And then they send a copy to who? They send a copy to the DEA. Which copy? Is it copy 1 or copy 2 that gets sent to the DEA? It's usually copy 2. Now the question is what are the colors of the DEA? What's copy 1? Copy 1 is usually brown. And then copy 2 is it blue or is it green? It's green, right? And then copy 3, the copy that you normally see, is blue, right? We're going to look at that. We'll have to Google that one later if you want to look it up for you to make sure you know what different copies and copy 1, copy 2, and copy 3 are, because that's all important. Now the question there is that you're going out of business. Whose 222 form is being used to complete the transfer of Schedule 2s? It's the purchaser. So if you're going out of business, you act as the wholesaler. You're acting like the distributor. Okay? So you have to remember to retain a copy and send a copy to the DEA. Okay? The 5% rule is that of the total number of dosage units of all controlled substances distributed by a practitioner during a calendar year in which the practitioner is registered to dispense does not exceed 5% of the total number of dosage units. Okay? So the 5% rule. The reason for that is what? What type of registration do you have to operate your store? It's considered a pharmacy. If you start going above the 5% rule, you're acting more like a distributor or a wholesaler, and you're not appropriately licensed as such. What happens if a doctor wants to order a Schedule 4 controlled substance? And let's assume that your policies allow you to transfer that to a doctor. So a Schedule 4 controlled substance, a benzodiazepine. Doctor calls you up and says, I'd like to have some diazepam for my office use. You're the first day on the job. How do you transfer that? What's that? So you tell the doctor, give me a prescription for it? Yeah? No, that's not right. Why not? Because there's no specific patient. In order to write a prescription, you need to have an identified patient. In order to have an identified patient, there has to be a valid patient-physician relationship. So if there's no valid patient-physician relationship where the doctor wants to use that drug as a stock bottle or office supply, you can't use it for a prescription. So the normal transfer is by an invoice. Okay? So that's how you would document that sale. Now, normally speaking, if you're the XYZ pharmacy, you probably have a policy that says, no, I can't do that. Okay? Legally, they do allow you to do that. However, the best way is for the doctor to actually get the drug through a wholesaler. Yeah?
So some companies use seesaw for the C2 instead of CA form.
So some companies use seesaws? Yeah. So in some pharmacies, and we'll have that coming up, is that they use the computer system, the CSOS, to order. So that is appropriate to use the electronic computer system ordering for the C2s. So that's acceptable as well. For the most part, what's that? The storing it and the paperwork, it's required by whatever is required. So you may be able to use electronic methods. You also may be able to require to have the printout of that and to put the printout away. It's got to be readily retrievable for any type of record. And also keep in mind that one of the things I recommend as a best practice is what? You have double copies of whatever. So, for example, you call the doctor's office, you document on the back of the prescription. Okay? And then you also document in the computer. The reason for that is what happens if the prescription gets lost or misfiled. You at least have the computer to find it. If the computer crashes, you at least have the prescription record. And the same thing holds true with any of these other records. You want to make sure that you have that. Okay. Dispersal or destruction of controlled substances, that's your DEA Form 41. Now, a lot of pharmacies will not engage in their own destruction of a controlled substance, right? In order to do that, you needed to fill out a Form 41. You needed to get approval by the DEA prior to destroying. So what a lot of pharmacies have done now is that they engage a third-party contractor, what they call a reverse distributor. And basically what they do is they take your outdated drugs and destroy it. Within the Form 41 from the DEA, one of the important things that you need to note there is that if you're still using this, you need to comply with the requirements. So you need to ask for permission before destroying. You also need to have you have to have two persons witnessing the destruction. Usually it is two healthcare providers, or you have one healthcare provider and one law enforcement agent noticing the destruction. And then you also have to keep your records there for your period of time. If you work in a hospital, you may also have a blanket authorization because you may need to go through destruction more than once a year. Okay? But for the most part, what you see in the real world pharmacy, in the retail pharmacy, is that they engage reverse distributors. Waste Management, I believe, is one of the reverse distributors. They'll come in. Your company will tell you that during such and such day, expect somebody to come in to get rid of all your expired, outdated, and quarantine-controlled substances. And they'll come in and they'll destroy your products. And the reason for that is because in the old days, when you used to destroy a controlled substance, there's two manners in which you can destroy, right? What are the two methods in which most people used to destroy controlled substances? There was flushing down a toilet, which violates the Clean Water Act, okay? Which is why you also, when you destroy, you have to follow all the federal laws, rules, and regulations, which include the Clean Water Act. So that's why we don't flush the drugs down the toilet anymore. Second method is
Incineration.
by burning. Okay? I thought you guys in New Hampshire would have had that one. Because you like to burn things up there, I guess, right?
Yeah.
But when you burn, you violate the Clean Air Act. Okay? So you have to comply. And that's why a lot of pharmacies use reverse distributors. And then also keep in mind that when it's a Schedule 2, you need a 222 form. And in that instance, whose 222 form is being utilized? You're dealing with a reverse distributor. Whose 222 form is being utilized? It would be the reverse distributor's 222 form they will be sending to you. You are the supplier. You have to retain a copy, send a copy to the DEA. Okay? Theft or loss. What do you know about the 106 forms? Theft or loss. So it's a significant theft or loss. So if you have a theft, you automatically have to report. So you've been robbed. You have to report. You also have a significant loss. So when we look at the word significant, you see I use quotations around significant. What's significant mean? Is one tablet significant?
Can be.
The answer is it depends. So it could be. And the reason for it is that when you look at significant, what you're going to look at is you're going to look and see, well, what's the schedule of the drug that's missing? Is it a Schedule 2 versus a Schedule 5 versus something that's not regulated by the federal government? Okay? What's the abuse potential? What about the abuse potential for the missing items in that area? Right? So nationally, this drug may not be abused, but in your area, it may be abused. Also, what is the quantity? Is it one tablet? Well, if it's one tablet, would it be reportable? That's where you have to do your due diligence, right? Two examples for you. You open a brand new bottle of a benzodiazepine, and there's 100 tablets in there. Or it's supposed to be 100. But when you open it up, you find 2 tablets that are cut in half, and there's only 98 full tablets in there. What do you do in that instance? Report to the 106 to the DEA that you have a significant theft or loss? In that instance, probably not. But what you do is you have to document the fact that you're 2 tablets short. And what you would do is you would document the fact that you open up a brand new bottle, document with the lot number, the expiration date, the manufacturer, be specific, and then you would document what happened. You opened it up and 2 tablets were split in half. Okay? And then you do your deductions and your inventory that way. Now, take that difference from when John the pharmacist works. John the pharmacist works, and what he does is says, 1 for you, 1 for me. Right? That could be significant because 1 tablet, every time John the pharmacist counts out drug X, 1 for you, 1 for me, is more than 1 tablet per year, right? That could be a couple hundred, could be a couple thousand. Okay? That is significant. Okay? What you always do is, well, if there's a question, do you report? And believe it or not, you err on the side of reporting. So it's easy to say you've been robbed because you see the pharmacy alarm going, or you hear the pharmacy alarm going off, you see the gates pulled apart, and you've been robbed, or you were in a robbery. That's easy, right? But sometimes when you're working and you'll say, something doesn't look right here, right? And you may think that you were robbed when in fact there was a floating pharmacist that destroyed your whole store, right? They didn't put the stuff back the way that they were supposed to. Or what they did was, and I don't know if this ever happens to you, but when you're doing C2s, you have a perpetual inventory for your C2s going, and then you do your audit on, let's say your company policy says you do it every Sunday. You do the audit, and it says that you're short 30 tablets, and the first thing that goes to your mind is what? I've been robbed. 30 tablets of drug X because it's a controlled substance. Is that the first thing that goes through your mind? Probably not, right? Cooler heads do prevail on that one. Why? Because 30 tablets sounds like it could be a prescription. And then somebody might have forgot to record that prescription in your bound book. So if you would have said, oh, I'm short 30, I got to report to the DEA, yeah, that's fine, right? But then afterwards, you reported that, then what? You now have to call the DEA and the state police back up and say, oops, I made a mistake. But that's okay because you erred on the side of reporting. But when you see it was 30 tablets, you're like, no, I think somebody forgot to record that. Now take that where if it was 27 tablets missing. Then with something like that, an odd number or 2 tablets missing, you're thinking something weird is happening there. So that's where you would report that one. Okay. In-transit loss. Who has the duty to report? What is an in-transit loss? Well, an in-transit loss kicks in as the following. You're working in the store, and how many of you work with a pharmacist that doesn't check the inventory in for controlled substances before the driver leaves? So the driver comes in with your deliveries, and they say, here, sign here. Pharmacist signs off on it. And then afterwards, after the signature has occurred, they then open up the controlled substance box, and they find out that 3 bottles are missing. Who has the duty to report there? In that instance, it's the pharmacy. Why? Because when they dropped it off, the delivery is dropped off, you sign by saying everything on the invoice matches what's in and what's accounted for. Now all of a sudden, you signed off on it, you open it up and you check, you're 3 bottles short. It's your loss, right? On the other hand, if you didn't sign it and you didn't check it in and the van was robbed 3 stops before yours and you never signed off on it, it's the wholesaler or whoever that has possession has to record that loss and report the 106. Okay? Now take that example and then go a different step. There's a product on the market. It's a cough syrups, right? And we'll talk about 2 different cough syrups. Robitussin with codeine. How do those normally come? Glass or plastic bottle?
Plastic.
That usually comes in plastic, right? How about the Tussionics cough syrup?
Always lost.
That usually comes in a glass bottle. All right? So let's say, hypothetically, whatever will happen to you, correct, is that you get your order in, and you have your Golden Flow, your Tussionics, right? What schedule does Tussionics fall under?
2.
Tussionics is a schedule.
2.
What is Tussionics? It's Hydrocodone.
Oh.
Oh, there we go, right? It's a Schedule 2. All right? Now what happens is that Tussionyx glass bottle falls and breaks on the floor. That never happens, right? You can never see that breaking and happening in your store. It happened. What do? What do you do? Well, let's look at the options. Super Tech comes over with a mop. Right? Technician comes over with a mop, mops it up, puts it in the mop bucket, and flushes it down the toilet. What have you done there? You cleaned the floor. But you violated the Clean Water Act, number one. Number two, you also destroyed a controlled substance without DEA's permission. You didn't fill out a DEA Form 41 prior to doing the destruction. That's not good. All right? What do you, the new pharmacist graduate who just passed the MPJE, do? What you get a syringe and bring it up that way? You need a big syringe. That's a pint bottle, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to collect it off the floor the best that you possibly can, put it in another plastic bottle, put it in a quarantine area, label it as drug X with the lot number, expiration date, everything that you possibly can. Put a note in there that says it dropped, and here's our glass bottle, whatever your policy says that you need to do, right? You then put that in and wait for the destruction, and then that's good, right? That's an option. Option 3 is you pick it up off the floor. You then put it in another bottle and dispense it to a patient. What have you done there? That's not good. Why? You got the product that's now adulterated, right? It not only has dirt on the floor, but potentially glass. Okay? So don't do that. So the best option is to quarantine and put it away for your destruction. Okay? See how it differs from a in-transit loss. Okay? Record keeping, you have to keep your records. And generally speaking, unless your state law is different, most of the times under federal law, is that, and also in the afternoon for Mass, I will give you a little clue, is that most of the time the record keeping requirements are 2 years. Now for New Hampshire, the record keeping requirements will be different and follow what the requirements are for New Hampshire. Okay? But record keeping, unless it's Medicare, 10 years. A lot of times pharmacists, they're pack rats, and the reason that they're pack rats is they save everything for a long period of time. Those of you that have your computers here or your phones, go on eBay. I bet you can go onto eBay today and to try to find a prescription from the era of Prohibition. When was Prohibition? 1930s, right? Maybe 20s, 30s, right? What was that dealing with? The sale of alcohol? Right? I bet you if you go on eBay today, you can find a prescription from the 1920s or 30s for a prescription for alcohol. And that just goes to show you that the pharmacists are pack rats and they save everything, right? But technically speaking, the reason they do it is because of statute of limitations or the fact that they don't want to be held for violating a Controlled Substance Record-Keeping Act. Okay? You can keep your records in a paper form or in electronic method. But remember, you keep them for a period under the Controlled Substance Act, at least 2 years. But it's wise to keep it longer because the state statute of limitations, but also, like in the cases of Medicare, it's a 10-year period of time. Okay? Also, your inventories for Schedule 1s and 2 drugs must be kept separate. Your invoices separate from all other invoices. So your Schedule 3, 4s, and 5 invoices separate from your Schedule 1s and 2s. Can you use electronic prescriptions? So we noted earlier that New York says everything needs to be electronic. So the question is, can you use electronic prescriptions for the controlled substances? The answer is yes. If not, everybody in New York would be violating the federal laws. Okay? The only thing that you have to keep in mind is that there is a difference between a fax prescription and an electronic prescription. Okay? What's the deal with a fax? A fax, it's basically handwritten, right? And a fax prescription goes from the prescriber's office to the pharmacy electronically. There's no way that somebody can hack into a fax and change that prescription from Motrin to Vicodin, correct? With an electronic prescription, how is that transmitted? It goes from provider directly to the pharmacy? No. There's what they call a RX hub or a third-party hub, right? So it goes from prescriber to the hub, from the hub to the pharmacy. So there's a chance, and this is what the DEA has always been watching for. And this is why there's only approved vendors by the DEA that allow for electronic prescribing, is that that hub needs to be able to be validated and authenticated and be free from people hacking in and changing prescriptions from, let's say, Motrin to Vicodin and then sending it off. Okay? So there is a difference between electronic and fax prescriptions. Okay? The DEA's manual, pharmacist manual, goes into your inventory records. We already talked about that. That's your biannual inventory every 2 years, exact count of Schedule 1s and 2s, and in substances where your packages for Schedules 3, 4s, and 5s greater than 1,000, right? Record-keeping requirements, they need to be readily retrievable. You keep the actual printed copy, or you can have electronic copies. If you have it electronic, that means that you can use your electronic system, but they need to be readily retrievable. They need to be identified as such. Okay? So now let's start talking about filing methods. Under federal law, how many different ways can you file prescriptions under federal law? So under federal law, there are 2. It changed a few years back. There used to be 3 methods, but now there's 2. Okay? So the 2 methods, the way that you file option 1 is you have a file for Schedule 2s. You have a second file for Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s. And you have a third file for all non-prescription drugs. Okay? That's what we use in Mass. Which method do you use in New Hampshire? This one? Okay. Option 2 is you have 2 separate files. You have a file for Schedule 2s, and then you have a second file for Schedules 3, 4s, 5s, and everything else you have a prescription for. If you use this method, you have to make your 3, 4s, and 5s readily retrievable. How do you make them readily retrievable? You use a red C. The C stamp has to be at least 1 inch in height. Okay? So in New Hampshire, option 1 or 2?
1.
Option 1, okay. Initial inventories. Good thing to know here that you're opening your own store. On the day that you open your own store, you have no controlled substances on shelf. So your initial day that you open, you have 0 controlled substances. Do you have to do an initial inventory? The answer is yes. What inventory records do you put down? All zeros. It's called a 0 inventory. On day 2 of your opening, you get the drugs in. You don't need to adjust the initial inventory. Why? Because you already opened. It was a 0 inventory. A lot of times you work in the companies, everything's electronic. You have a running perpetual inventory of all your controlled substances. Okay? Another issue to keep in mind is that not only with the biannual inventory, but any time that the DEA reschedules a drug, and if there's a rescheduling in the drug, you have to conduct an inventory of that on the date that it becomes a controlled substance. So, for example, when we talked about Caraspodal, it went from a unregulated product to a Schedule 4. So we noted earlier, many years ago in pharmacy law, remember you had the Federal Register, and on a Federal Register, that's where you find about notices and comments and proposed regulations. So in the Federal Register, on such and such day, it was posted by the DEA that Caraspodal was going to be changed from an unregulated scheduled drug to a Schedule 4. On that day, what was supposed to have happened is that your pharmacy needed to then do an initial counting of that, and then to put the number of tablets of that newly scheduled product into your biannual inventory. Hopefully you all did that. Okay. Other forms, we didn't talk about this one, but in order to order a 222 form, if you're using the old paper method, you fill out a form 222A. Okay? Also, things to keep in mind is that when you request the order forms, the DEA, unless you have special permission from the DEA, they're usually in envelopes consisting of 7 sets of forms, and you can basically maximally order just 6 of these envelopes unless you have permission from the DEA. Okay? When you receive these order forms, one of the things that you're supposed to do is that you're supposed to record the serial numbers just in case somebody steals your 222 forms. I know nobody who was ever robbed of a 222 form. I've heard of pharmacies being robbed of their Schedule II drugs, but nobody's ever come into a pharmacy saying, give me all your 222 forms, right? But you do have to keep the serial numbers down. If you don't record the serial numbers and you have a theft or loss of a 222 form, you're in trouble, right? But you also, the DEA gives you a get-out-of-jail card by saying, well, what's the approximate date that you ordered those? So you need to have those record-keeping requirements there as well. Okay. When you complete your order form 222, it's important that when you do that you complete it in a non-negligent manner. Remember, you have to put the date down and the number of tablets or containers received. If you use the ditto mark, that's negligent record-keeping. That could result in a fine. Okay. Important things to note here, since you don't read the newspaper. The whole issue, and you'll see a different drug that's hitting the market with, I guess they place it with the heroin, carfentanil. Anybody know what carfentanil is? It's an elephant tranquilizer. You read the newspaper? No?
Yes.
These are veterinarian meds, carfentanil, atorphine, and I don't know, dipro, I don't know what that one is, right? But take 2 seconds, write these drugs down. If you see this on the MPJE, important thing to note here is that these 3 drugs, they're veterinarian meds, but they have to be, if they're ordered, they have to be ordered using their own separate DEA 222 form. You can't use it with another 222 form like oxycodone. Okay? These have to be ordered on their own form. And if you're reading the newspapers, carfentanil is hitting the news because that's mixed in there with heroin and things like that, along with fentanyl. Okay? Which is kind of weird in my thinking because if carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer or a large animal tranquilizer, where are they getting it from? So it can only be from veterinarians or from veterinarian pharmacies or someplace else, right? But it's a closed system, so people should know where these are coming from. And in the news, believe it or not, I was reading a couple days ago that people are starting to hurt their animals. And what they're doing is they're like purposely hurting their animals, taking them to the vet, hoping the vets will give the animal some type of opioid. And people would then abuse that. Okay. So, moral of the story, 3 drugs that are vet meds, order form 222, separate order forms. Okay. So here's the colors. I know I had you up in suspense on this. Copy 1 is usually brown. Copy 2 is green. Copy 3 is blue. Copy 1 goes to the supplier. That's retained by the supplier. Copy 2 is sent to the supplier, but it's forwarded off to the DEA. And copy 3 is retained by the purchaser. The way I remember it is as follows. If you're purchasing it, right, you take the 3rd copy, right, and you retain it there, right? So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. You retain the blue copy, so it's copy 3. And then if you're the supplier, you keep copy 1 and you send off copy 2 to the DEA. Okay, so just remember the order. I don't know if they're going to ask the colors of the different forms. Remember in pharmacy law, I asked you the colors for copy 1. You all told me that color was white. And the reason for it is you're using an electronic computer system. And when you're using a computer system, if you print out the copy, most likely you're using your printer to copy it or print it out. And most likely the color of the paper in your printer is white. Okay? I guarantee if you change that color of the paper in the printer to green, blue, or brown, it would be the right color. But anyway, that's the reason why they're white. And you'll say, no. And I'm telling you, yes for these colors. Okay? We talked about the power of attorney, and then there's your computer order entry system for the DEA 222s. Right? Other issues within the pharmacist manual include prescription requirements. We noted from our discussion briefly earlier is that a prescription must be dated and signed on the date when issued. So can somebody else prepare the prescription for the prescriber? So can a medical assistant or a nurse prepare the prescription for the doctor? So they can do that. What the medical assistant or the nurse, whoever it is, as long as they're the authorized agent of the provider, is that they can write the patient's name, address, the date, the name of the drug, the quantity, directions for use. The only thing that they can't do is to sign for the doctor. Okay? Remember, prescription requirements for Schedules 2, 3, 4, and 5 require the patient's full name as well as the address. What changes can you make on a C2 prescription? Can you add the address? And the answer is, we're going to look at that in the afternoon, because at one time, it used to be the DEA that said you could make the following changes. And then what happened was that we had the multiple issuance of C2 prescriptions, and they rescinded a policy on what changes the DEA would allow. And so what they then did was that the DEA says, we'll allow what the state boards of pharmacy or the states allow you to add on there. So those of you staying with me, we will look in the afternoon on what changes you can make on a C2 prescription and what changes you can make on a C3, 4, and 5. But for the most part, you can add the patient's address on there without the doctor's permission. Okay? Prescriptions also need to be written in ink or indelible pencil. What's indelible pencil mean? It's a pencil that you can't erase. Why didn't they put indelible ink on there? There's eraser, or there's ink that you can erase. Right? The other item is that, remember, the prescriptions must be manually signed by the practitioner. And the practitioner is responsible for making sure the prescription conforms with all state law. Your purpose of issue needs to be issued for a patient, written by a practitioner using their corresponding responsibility, but there needs to be a valid patient-physician relationship as well. Okay? And that usually means that the patient was seen by the physician, not by filling out a questionnaire online and sending in a fee. Okay? There has to be a medical record that was been created. Other items, you have your C2 prescriptions. Can you take a fax for a C2?
Only hospice.
Can you take a fax for a C2 prescription?
Yeah.
The answer is yes. Okay? So you can take a fax for a C2. The general rule is that a C2 prescription must be written. Okay? There are two exceptions. You could take an oral prescription, otherwise known as a telephone order, otherwise known as a verbal order, if it's an emergency situation. The other thing is that you can take a fax for a C2 if what? There's three limited circumstances. Number one is that the patient is in a long-term care facility. Question I have for you is, what is a long-term care facility? It's a skilled nursing facility? What about adult daycare?
No.
No, right? It's normally your traditional long-term nursing home type of facility, okay? Criteria number two is what? So you got long-term care. Is that it? Nope, there's two more. Hospice. Patient needs to be in a hospice program. What's a hospice program? Means that person has a short time to live, right? Usually 6 months or less, right? In New York, pharmacy got in trouble here because there was a hospice program that once people were involved in it, they were living 10, 12 years, right? They got hit for a fraud, waste, and abuse issue on that one. But anyway, hospice program. And what's the third program, or what's the third exception for a fax? The third exception is where it's an implantable IV or subcutaneous pump, or IM, right? You can use a fax for that. If they're in long-term care or hospice, the prescription must be documented that they're a long-term care or hospice patient. Okay. Can you use the fax to get the prescription ready?
Yes.
The answer is, generally speaking, the answer is yes. However, you cannot release that drug without receiving the actual fax. So a lot of pharmacists will not use that fax to get the prescription ready. Why? Because there's no guarantee that the patient will come to that pharmacy. Number two is that there's no guarantee that you may be busy and you'll forget to get the handwritten copy. And then there also has to be that final check to make sure that nothing has changed on the prescription. Okay? So faxing, know the exceptions for the C2 prescriptions. Partial fills. When we think of partial fills for a C2, it's usually prescription calls for 60. You only have 20 tablets left, right? In that instance, what you have to remember is that you have to remember that the remaining balance needs to be filled within 72 hours. If not, you have to cancel out the remaining tablets that are due to the patient and notify the prescriber. The one exception is in long-term care. And the reason for long-term care or for patients with a medical diagnosis of a terminal illness is that you can partial fill a C2 prescription for these instances. But you have to have a record that the patient's terminally ill or long-term care. And you can fill these up to a 60-day supply. So 60 days from the date of issuance for those. And the rationale there is that if they're terminally ill, today you get a prescription for 1,000 tablets of oxycodone, and then they expire tomorrow. Then you have an issue of what do you do with all these extra tablets. So a lot of times they may dose out smaller amounts. How about oral prescriptions for C2? Oral C2s happen when? Well, we need to know that it needs to be an emergency situation. And then remember, from pharmacy law, the emergency situation, we spent a couple classes on this. We talked about it. Number one is that it's got to be for the immediate administration of the controlled substances necessary for the proper treatment of the intended ultimate user. Number two is that there's no appropriate alternative treatment that's available. And three, that it's not reasonably possible for the prescribing practitioner to provide the written prescription. Note here, and this is why people say that law is tough and tricky, it's because of the and. What does that and word mean right there? What's the placement of the and? You see a semicolon with the word and.
All of the
That means one, or it means A and B and C. If we replace the word and with the word or, does that change anything? Yes. How does it change it? It means one or two or three. Okay? In this instance, it's and, so you need all three. How does it come up? Well, the immediate administration of the controlled substance is needed for the proper treatment of the patient. Okay? Patient broke their arm. They need codeine. Does that meet that?
Yeah.
Subjectively, meets it to me. I see others saying no. Okay? So, first part, immediate administration of the controlled substance necessary for the proper treatment of the intended ultimate user. So in that instance, I say, yep, go with it, it's pain. Right? You say no, then you say it's not an emergency. Okay? But I say yes, so let's go on to the next part. That it's no appropriate alternative treatment is available. How does codeine come? Codeine in Schedule 2, 30 milligrams, Schedule 2 drug. How else does codeine come? Comes in acetaminophen with codeine. That's a Schedule 3. And how else does codeine come? The guaifenesin or the Robitussin with codeine. That's a Schedule 5. Would you use a cough syrup for pain? Probably not, right? So I would say no on a guaifenesin with codeine, right? Because get the amount of the codeine out of there, you're going to probably overdose on the guaifenesin or something like that, right? You're going to get sick from that. But we are now left with Tylenol with codeine. Can the patient take acetaminophen with codeine? Doctor says yes. Then do we need the codeine 30 milligram tablets anymore? Answer is no. Doctor says, on the other hand, nope, they're already taking high-dose acetaminophen. In that instance, well, it seems reasonable to me, right, that they need plain codeine. So now we got A, we got B. C, the doctor's office is above your pharmacy. They're in there. Does that meet the emergency criteria? No, why not? Because somebody can bring it down or you can send somebody upstairs. Okay? Now, let's get a little trickier here. It's that the doctor is in New York. They're on vacation, and they're calling in a prescription. Now you can't, right? But let me ask you this one. If they're in New York, how are they creating a record of the patient if they just broke their arm? Wouldn't you tell them to go to the emergency room, right? But how many of you work with pharmacists that will do that next step? Maybe. Some would. Some won't, right? But this is your license. You have to keep in mind for that. So that's the criteria for emergency situations. Now, the next part, because you're not done there, the next part then comes down to is, okay, you met the criteria for emergency situation. How much do I give? So you give enough for that emergency period. Sometimes you work with your preceptors, and this is another myth. Your preceptor said I can only give a 72-hour supply. Is that a true statement? Answer is no. The emergency period may only be one tablet or one dose. It may be a little bit longer than that 72-hour supply. For example, they call us in Friday morning, and it's a long weekend. So you got all day Friday, you got all day Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and then Tuesday. So it may be a 4 or 5 day. It's during that period of time. You also have to keep in mind that the prescription contains all the required information that's required by law on that script. So on your hard copy, your verbal order should have the patient's name, address, date, written, all the names of the drug, everything. Okay? And then what you have to then make sure that is happening is that within 7 days afterwards, is that the doctor provides a hard copy. And then you take the 2 copies. You take the verbal order and you take the hard copy and you staple it together. The hard copy from the doctor's office has to have authorization for emergency dispensing on it. Okay? Also keep in mind you may need to call back the prescriber to verify that they did call that drug in. Okay? So your good faith efforts. Okay?
Question on Manchester.
Yeah.
Does that have to be post-dated within 7 days, or it has to be in hand by 7 days?
My understanding of it is within 7 days after authorizing an emergency prescription, it has to be delivered.
Okay.
So it has to be not postmarked within the 7 days. It has to be actually within the 7 days at the pharmacy.
Thank you.
Yep. Usually what happens on day 4 or 5, you don't have the hard copy, you call the doctor's office up and says, listen, doc, I did a favor for you. Now you don't do this, I got to call the DEA. And usually they'll stop on the way home. Usually. Because they don't want anybody calling the DEA on them. Right? Labeling requirements under federal law. Labeling has to have the initial fill, the pharmacy name and address, serial number, the name of the patient, name of the prescriber, and directions for use and cautionary statements. What's missing? It's kind of ironic that the name of the drug is missing, correct? Yeah. So under federal law, it says you need to have this. So where do we get the drug name? Where do we get, like, the pharmacist's initials? Where do we get all that other stuff? We come and look at state law, because state law will make up for deficiencies in federal law. Okay? Also, keep in mind that for Schedules 2, 3, and 4, you also have to have the federal drug auxiliary label on there. It says, caution, federal law prohibits the transfer of this drug to any person other than a person for whom it was prescribed. You know that auxiliary sticker? Some pharmacies use that for every drug. Right? Your labels print that out for everything. That's misbranding. You also don't include that on Schedule 5s. Why? Because under federal law, Schedule 5 can be sold without a prescription. Okay? So if you put that auxiliary sticker on a Schedule 5, it's misbranding. Schedule 3s, 4s, and 5s. So let's take a look briefly. Schedule 3s and 4s. How many refills can have on Schedule 3s and 4s? You could have 5 monthly refills. When do they expire? 6 months. When do they expire for Schedule 5s? Under federal law, they don't. Is there a maximum number of refills under federal law for Schedule 5s? Answer is no. Okay? In the afternoon, when we look at mass law, we're going to look at a chart. If you're not taking mass law, look at your states to see what the requirements are for the maximum days supply for C2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. And anything else you have a prescription for. See if there's any restrictions on sales limits, and we'll cover that in state law in the afternoon. We talked earlier about the non-prescription Schedule 5 sales. That's your dispensing done by the pharmacist. You have a quantity limit. You have the purchaser at least 18. You have ID, the bound book, and it needs to be allowed by law. Okay. Talked about faxing. So faxing is Schedule 3, 4s, and 5s. The fax constitutes the hard copy. You don't need a hard copy follow-up for a fax. If it's an oral C2, 3, 4, or 5, you need the hard copy. But for a fax, they're considered the original. Okay. Also, one other important note about telephone authorizations is that when you take a telephone order, what's some best practices that you'll do? You'll write down the time, the date, and who you spoke to. And then you'll repeat back the order. And then you may use like a check mark next to it to verify that. And the reason for that is who can take a prescription over the phone? It's a pharmacist, an intern, and if state law allows, possibly a certified pharmacy tech, but not for Schedules 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay? Who could call in an order for the prescriber? It's the prescriber or an authorized agent. And the authorized agent can be a medical secretary, it could be a nurse, it could be the janitor, right? And we know in pharmacy that there's look-alike and sound-alike drugs, okay? So it's always important to read that back as a best practice. Okay. Transferring of prescriptions, can you transfer prescriptions in Schedules 2? The answer is no. Can you transfer a prescription in 3, 4, and 5? The answer is yes. How many times can you transfer?
Once.
How many times can you transfer?
Once.
It depends. It's going to depend on a number of factors. Number one, your state law. Number two, your policy. But under federal law, you can transfer only one time if your computer system is not shared in real time. So you go from the XYZ pharmacy to the ABC pharmacy, 2 different pharmacies. Do their computer records share with each other? And the answer is no. So in that instance, you go from one pharmacy to a totally separate chain pharmacy, one-time transfer. Okay? If you work in a pharmacy that the computer systems are just standalone and you can't check where the person is getting their drugs refilled at a real-time online prescription profile setting, it's a one-time transfer. And the law says that if it's a real-time online profile sharing system, so you can check where the patient is at any given time, you can transfer as many times as there are remaining refills. Okay? One of the major pharmacy chains says only one-time transfer. That's a policy, not a law. Okay? PMP programs, prescription monitoring programs, we'll cover a little bit in the afternoon. This is basically a shared program where before the doctor writes a prescription, they check a database. After the pharmacist fills the prescription, they return the information to the state. Some states also may require that the pharmacist check the monitoring program before dispensing. In Mass, anybody know what the project is called? It's MassPat. It's the database you check. Before the doctor prescribes, they check a database. They want to make sure that there's no forged prescriptions, no doctor shopping. A lot of the states are entering into collaborative practices between the various states that they can check on a nationwide level for these doctor shoppers. Okay? So the PMP program, probably want to spend some time reviewing that. Internet pharmacies, usually they are allowed. Spend some time taking a look at the requirements. 2 things here to note is that number 1, we could talk about an internet pharmacy being the actual pharmacy. If you're going to engage in internet pharmacy business and you're going to engage in the sale of controlled substances, you have to comply with the Ryan-Haidt Act. The Ryan-Haidt Act is also found in the pharmacist manual. Spend a few minutes reviewing the Ryan-Haidt Act and your requirements for registering and the like for that. But also when you're looking at prescriptions as a pharmacist, can you fill a prescription? And the question comes down to is, how do you know it's a valid prescription? And one of the things that comes up with is that many states do not allow for a doctor to write a prescription based off a questionnaire. Okay, it needs to be a valid patient-physician relationship, which means that there has to be a medical complaint. There has to be a medical history that's taken. There has to be a physical exam that's been done. And there has to be some logical connection between the medical complaint, the medical condition, and the drug that's being prescribed. In order to get Vicodin, you pay a person a $50 fee and fill out a questionnaire. Is that legal? The answer is probably not. What happens if you get that prescription and you fill it? Then you've violated the Controlled Substance Act under your corresponding responsibility. This also comes up into play with what they call the rogue internet providers and the rogue internet pharmacies. Okay? Can you partial fill a Schedule 3 through 5?
Yep.
Yes. What's the rule? It's that for 3s and 4s that you don't partial fill or you don't fill anything beyond the 6 months from the date that it's issued. Number 2 is that if you do partial fills, you have to make sure that the quantity dispensed doesn't exceed the quantity authorized by the practitioner. How about PRN refills? What's a PRN refill? So refill as needed. Check your state law to see if they're allowed. In Massachusetts, they are not allowed. That's a 0 refill. Okay. Here's your slide on the Ryan Height Act. Central fill. Take some time to review the central fill pharmacies so that you understand what a central fill is, as well as take a look at long-term care. Usually the issue with long-term care facilities is that a long-term care facility is usually a nursing home. Most nursing homes do not have in their own nursing home facility a pharmacy. So how does the pharmacy, or how are drugs provided to long-term care? It's usually by a long-term care provider which delivers the drug to the long-term care facility. So then the question then comes up is the distance between the pharmacy and the nursing home. It could be next door. It could be 50, 60 miles away. Patient is in an emergency crisis. They're having a seizure. They don't have a standing order for a benzodiazepine for the seizure. What do?
9 boxes.
It would come out of the kit. So each of the nursing homes, they have an emergency kit. One of the things you should take a look at is what drugs do the states allow to have in the emergency kit. Most of them you'll see some type of pain med, like a morphine or something like that, a codeine. You'll also see benzodiazepines in there. And the reason for that is because that the patient needs it. And usually the kits are locked. Okay? They're locked, and once the seal is broken, then the pharmacy has to take it back, and then there has to be a covered prescription for that. And then another kit is sent to the nursing home. Okay? That's your emergency kits. Methadone. Methadone is for, in the retail pharmacy setting, used for severe pain. In the old days, it used to be methadone. Used to be able for a pharmacist to dispense up to a 3-day supply at 1 day's supply at each dosing. You can't do that anymore. It's been taken out of the pharmacist manual. Okay? But methadone in the retail pharmacy setting is for severe pain. Can't use it for cough. Okay? It's severe pain. Also note that methadone, 40 milligrams, not in the retail pharmacy setting. Methadone 40 is in a pain clinic, or not in a pain clinic, in a methadone clinic. Okay? One of the things you're always going to be battling and to always try to figure this out is intractable pain, and how do you manage pain in the retail setting? And you're always going to have that. Is 540 tablets of a C2 reasonable? It's one of those judgment calls. Okay? So that's what you're always going to have. You're going to have terminal illness and intractable pain, and what's the maximum dose of a pain med that you can give a patient? Okay? Postal requirements, can you mail drugs?
Yes.
The answer is yes. Are there any restrictions on mailing C2s? The answer is no. You can mail C2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. The only carve out here is that you follow the U.S. Post Office regulations. And the Post Office regulations basically say that you can't put any markings on the outside of the envelope saying that there's drugs on the inside. Okay? So you have to make sure you have an outside label as well as the drug labeled on the inside. Not going to spend any time going through the DEA registration or anything like that for you, but you should know how the DEA registration numbers are utilized and how they're checked. Right? You should know that for prescribers, they began with the letter A. All the A series have been used up. They went to Bs. You would think the logical next step would be what? C? Nope. F. So it went A, B, F. I don't know what happened C, D, or E. But anyway, those are a mystery. Usually what then happens is that for mid-level practitioners, Frank Hauser rule number 2, mid-level practitioners are who? Physician assistants, nurse practitioners. Who else? PAs. How about pharmacists? A pharmacist could be a mid-level practitioner. Okay? Mid-level practitioners, their DEA numbers begin M. Way I remember it, mid-level, M. M for mid, M for DEA number. There you go. Sooner or later, all the M's will be used up. It will be interesting to see if the DEA goes with the letter N. I bet they go to Z or Q or something like that, right? Who knows? P and R's used to be in the old days a reference for distributors or in pharmacies. So sometimes you might have seen pharmacies with a registration of P or R. Other times I've seen them with A's as well. All right? And then there's the digits. You have the actual First 2 digits correspond to the type of practitioner. The second digit corresponds to the physician's initial of their last name. And then there's numbers. Okay, you have the numbers, and those are your test digits. So, for example, which of the following digits could make the following DEA number an authentic DEA registration number? So how do we check this out? So we take the first, the third, and the fifth digits. We add those together. Okay? We then take the second, the fourth, and sixth. Add those together, multiply that by the number 2. Right? So we got the first, third, and fifth. We got 1, 5, and 2. We get 8. We got the second, fourth, and sixth together. We got 10. Multiply that by 2. The important thing here is remember always multiply, or always add first, then multiply. Do it some other way, you get some other wacky number. It won't work. Okay. Add the two sums together, you get 28. That 8 is in the 28 would be the 8 in the last digit of the DEA number. Okay. What about if the doctor is registered as a qualified physician under the Data Act? What would their DEA number look like? So their DEA number would look just like their regular DEA number. And if they're an authorized or qualified physician under the Data Act, they would have a second DEA number, which would look and begin with the letter X and everything else the same. Okay? So they'd have 2 DEA numbers. The only difference is if the letter X would be that they're qualified under the Data Act. What if it was a resident of a hospital? What's their DEA number that they're using? Be the hospital DEA number. How do you differentiate out the residents? Be a suffix number. And that suffix number would be assigned to that individual resident. Just keep in mind that many forgers know how to make DEA numbers. If you're bored one night in the bathroom, sleeping, whatever, dreaming, thinking of ways to fall asleep, think of DEA numbers and testing them out. You can think of them as many as you want, right? The Data Act is the Drug Addiction and Treatment Act. This is your Subutex and Suboxone. Okay. One of the things that you also keep in mind is that you have the qualified physician. The criteria is that they have to be a board certified in addiction psychiatry or addiction medicine, or in the alternative, have at least 8 hours of authorized training in the area of the treatment and management of opioid-dependent patients. I don't understand that because on the one hand, you got board certification versus an 8-hour training program. But it is a way of getting qualified physicians into the community setting rather than into a methadone clinic. Okay? And if you have never dispensed Subutex or Suboxone, take a couple minutes, go on to the FDA's website. There's an FDA website for Subutex, Suboxone, and to look at information for pharmacists. Why? There's issues on confidentiality that relate to Subutex and Suboxone that you should be familiar with. The Comprehensive Methamphetamine Control Act of 1996. Also, we can look at the Patriot Act. It places 3 drugs. You have Sudafed, phenylpropanolamine, and ephedrine into sales restrictions, right? So basically, long story short, is that a patient comes into your pharmacy and wants to buy Sudafed. Can you sell them Sudafed? Yes. How much can you sell them? You could sell them daily up to 3.6 grams per day. In a 30-day time period, it's up to 9 grams. If they're a mobile kiosk or by mail order, the maximum amount in a 30-day period is 7.5 grams. Every pharmacy that sells it or any store that sells it needs to make sure that it's a controlled access to the Sudafed, phenylpropanolamine, and ephedra, which means that you also have to undergo training through the Attorney General yearly on the sale of Sudafed. Okay? Why is that? Because that's how they make methamphetamines and all those bad drugs. Other things that you need to know is that when you sell the Sudafed, they have to be in blister pack. Okay? So question for you. My daughter is 14 years of age. She comes into your pharmacy, and she says, and because this is what I do, I send my daughter into the store to try to test you. Right? We have nothing better to do on our weekends than to think of ways to torment pharmacy students and pharmacists. No, I'm just kidding. Right? I send my daughter into the store. She has a valid ID. She has a passport. She goes into your store and wants to buy Sudafed. Can you sell her Sudafed? So I see no and I see yes, and I hear you have to be 18. So the answer is, can you sell my daughter the Sudafed? The answer technically is yes, there is no sales restriction on Sudafed. Okay? So technically, she has a valid issued government ID. Fine.
Store policy will say no.
It may be a store policy, but it's not a legal policy, or it's not a law. Right? Now, let's take another example. Where else do we talk about age limits?
Needles.
We talked about it with buying Robitussin with codeine. Okay? I come into your pharmacy, I want to buy Robitussin with codeine. If the state law allows, I can buy Robitussin with codeine in your store, correct? It's for my daughter who is 15 years of age. Can you sell it to me?
Yeah.
The answer is yes. Why? I thought you had to be 18.
Yeah, you do. Purchase.
The purchaser needs to be over 18. You see how you have to unpack everything and know the differences. Okay? In the afternoon, we're going to talk about selling of syringes. We're going to talk about quantity limits and mass law. But the Combat Meth Act, you got your ID there. You do have to sign a logbook. The logbook could be electronic or it could be written. The key here is that you just need a logbook. Nowhere does it say that they all have to be interconnected. And then also take a look at the pharmacy law or the pharmacist manual for corresponding responsibility. That is also an important issue. All CEs recently, and for the past few years, have always talked about pharmacist corresponding responsibility. And that's a legitimate medical purpose. So you have a prescription for a controlled substance. It needs to be issued by a physician acting within their course of professional practice. Okay? So the doctor needs to be acting in their course of professional practice, and there's a corresponding responsibility which puts the pharmacist on the hook for this as well. So you have the dispensing and prescribing, the doctor and pharmacist both on the hook. Okay? The way that you normally see something like this is that a dentist writes a prescription for back pain for a narcotic. That's outside of their scope of practice. Okay? That's usually how it comes up. Pediatrician writing for an adult outside of their scope of practice. The gray area is that you have a radiologist writing for a pain med. Okay? That is one of those gray areas. Would you dispense? Would you not dispense? And the whole issue of why corresponding responsibility is out there is because of rogue internet providers. Okay? And these pharmacy mills. You'll hear it in the news about the pill mills. Right? So you have physicians writing millions of prescriptions per day. Well, maybe not millions per day, but they're writing thousands of prescriptions. And they pop up in malls all over the place in Florida and in the different states. And people go in there and get these prescriptions filled. And the prescriptions written by these doctors. Which is why in mass, when we look at mass law, we're going to talk about out-of-state narcotics. Okay? In your package, you'll see frequently asked questions from the DEA. What I recommend that you do is take a look on Blackboard, print these frequently asked questions out, and then try to answer the questions. You have access to it electronically, so what you can do is you can just cut and paste, and then use it electronically to put your answer on one side, and then make flashcards out of it and see if you can answer it. Okay? So use that there for you. Ipecac. I'm just going to tell you two things about it. Number one, if you see it, Ipecac has a red warning. I don't even think that they sell it in retail anymore. Okay? But in the old days, it used to be out there. There used to be a red box warning for it. It says that it's for emergency use for causing of vomiting and poisoning before using. Call a physician or a poison control poison control center. The reason why I want to tell you about this is that there has been some dosing errors that have occurred. So if you ever come in contact with Ipecac, there's a difference between Ipecac syrup and Ipecac fluid extract. Okay? The fluid extract is actually 14 times more potent than the syrup. It's also important to note that the Ipecac fluid extract is actually cardiotoxic. So what happened was that there was a nurse in the hospital, and the doctor asked for the Ipecac, and they thought it was the syrup when they instead gave them the Ipecac fluid extract, and the patient went into cardiac arrest. Okay? So there is a difference between Ipecac syrup versus syrup. Okay? So fluid extract is 14 times more potent than the syrup. So that brings me in line with like medication, look-alike, sound-alike drugs. Okay? Other items for you, and we talked about it earlier in the day, it's Poison Prevention Packaging Act. You have handouts for your references to take a look at the Poison Prevention Packaging Act. This is the easy off caps. So in this instance, there are certain instances that you need to know. The general rule is that to comply with the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, you as a pharmacist needs to dispense the drug in a child-resistant cap, unless the patient authorizes. If the patient authorizes, and if the patient asks, you can dispense it in the easy off cap. The waiver for a patient does not need to be in writing. It could be an oral request. It's good practice to get the patient to sign a waiver saying they want easy off cap. The reason for it is that if you do it by a verbal request and the patient's grandchild gets at the drugs, it's just an oral he said, she said. It's good to get it into writing. The other thing is sometimes you may see a doctor's prescription blank that says easy off caps. If the doctor writes easy off cap, it's only good for the life of that prescription, not a blanket order. The only one that can issue a blanket order is the patient. In the Poison Prevention Packaging Act materials that you'll see the drugs that are excluded from requiring the easy off cap. Okay? So you'll see the easy off cap on a list of 20 or 30 different drugs. Know those drugs. The basic and most familiar drug that we're all familiar with is nitroglycerin, but it's sublingual nitroglycerin. Not all doses of nitroglycerin can be dispensed in the easy off cap. Also in the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, you'll see a paragraph about iron tablets. Read the paragraph on iron tablets because you want to prevent children from being poisoned by accidental poisoning of iron-containing products, and there's blister packing requirements for that as well. So you know what beyond use date is and what the requirements for there are. And also within the federal side, we went through the list already, the Prescription Drug Marketing Act. This is where it requires wholesalers to be registered with the various boards and also put sales restrictions. We went through the recalls, make sure you understand recalls, adulterating, misbranding, kind of went through that as well. And then the other issue, when we look at it, is the federal regulations, right? Comes for a small percentage, but you want to get an A on this, so you want to know everything that you possibly can, right? So in your packet, I also included a CE on the federal regulation of medicines. You may want to use that also as a reinforcement tool because it does go through a brief overview of HIPAA, the Controlled Substance Act, and also some of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as well as its amendments. Okay? And then there's some questions that you can answer for those as well. Okay. Any questions on the federal side? The rest of the slides were all the amendments that you had in pharmacy law. Okay. We talked about med guides, briefly about new drug approval, the clinical phases, and the like. Okay. All right. Lunchtime. I guess I'll see you at 1 o'clock.
still up. Or no?
Hey, Casey.
Saturday. We are going
I didn't tell you.
disappointed. How are you? Good.
Oh no, I'll be okay.
Yeah, well, I think you all know you. Oh my God. He's the master. Why are you going through with all that trouble? Get it bigger. That looks good. I can do that.
Too quick.
Yeah.
That's my phone. That's my phone.
1, 2, 3. And if you don't mind, please.
Oh my God. Poor guy.
What about you?
I brought lunch.
There we go. Okay,
Good job. I don't know whose phone that was. Everybody's phone is like, it's mine.
Thank you.
All right, sit down. Let's go. Sit down. This is the one I
Questions?
Good job. Thank you so much.
All right.
Where are you know what I told him? I said I'm gonna talk to Aquaman. Bye guys, enjoy. You want your jacket? I need to. No, I'm not. No, they're that's about it.
I mean, like, you have to left the school if you don't have the number.
No, I don't have you.
Right. Give me your phone number.
Let's call this. I should know it.
Can't get my bag.
Did you take that?
No, you didn't. A pass, so you'll be fine.
And now they're picture.
Oh, there's like a
I know, it's like
blurry.
so fun.
Oh, now it's fine. Building. You can't possibly discuss. I don't know if you closed your eyes. Probably. I did. A lot of
Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
Ready, set.
that's the thing, like, I don't know where.
until I start applying for
No, I can only do like one thing at a time.
Well, that's why.
I mean,
On my mind right now to get and when I do that, I'll just.